They laughed at her. Every single night, while the rest of the unit stripped their gear and collapsed onto their cots, Mara Voss lay down with a sniper rifle pressed against her chest like it was the only thing keeping her alive. Some called it paranoia. Some called it weakness, wearing a soldier's face. Nobody called it what it actually was. Warning. By the time the sun cracked over Black Ridge Valley, half that camp would be breathing because of the woman they mocked, and the other half would spend the rest of their lives wondering how they missed what she saw coming. If you're new here, subscribe, hit that bell, and drop your city in the comments so I can see exactly how far this story travels. You do not want to miss what comes next. The first thing you noticed about Black Ridge Valley was the silence. Not the good kind. Not the quiet that settles after a long day when the world finally lets you breathe. This was the silence of something holding its breath. Mountains packed with snow pressing down on a camp that had no business existing this far out, this high up, this deep into country that didn't want them there. The forward operating base was a collection of canvas tents, reinforced plywood walls, and corrugated steel sheeting bolted together in ways that looked temporary but had somehow survived 3 brutal winters. Heating coils ran under the floors and rattled through the night. The generator coughed every 4 hours like a sick dog that refused to die. Supply lines ran through a single mountain pass 12 kilometers to the south, which made everyone who understood logistics quietly uncomfortable and everyone who didn't understand logistics aggressively overconfident. It was 01:30 hours when Staff Sergeant Cole Ramsey made his first round of the tent. He moved slowly, the way men move when they've learned that hurrying accomplishes nothing except burning energy you might need later. His boots barely made a sound on the packed dirt floor. His breath came out in short, pale clouds that disappeared before they reached the hanging lantern. He checked each cot by reflex, not looking for anything specific, just doing what NCOs do when they can't sleep and need their hands to feel useful. He almost walked past Voss entirely. She was lying on her back on the far cot, closest to the tent wall. Her sleeping bag was pulled up to her chin. Her eyes were closed. She looked, at first pass, like any other soldier finally surrendering to exhaustion. Then Ramsey's lantern swept across her and he stopped. The rifle was there, right there. Locked along the length of her body, the sling wrapped twice around her left forearm, the barrel angled toward the tent's low ceiling, the stock resting just under her collarbone. She'd pulled the sleeping bag around it like it was a second body she was keeping warm. Ramsey stood there for a long moment. Then, quietly enough not to wake anyone, he said, "Boss." Her eyes opened immediately. Not the groggy blinking of someone pulled from sleep. They opened clean, alert, focused, like they'd been waiting for exactly this. "Sergeant," she said, "you sleeping with your weapon again?" "Yes, Sergeant." He looked at the rifle. He looked at her. The lantern light made shadows move across her face in a way that made her expression hard to read. She was 29 years old, dark-haired, with the kind of lean build that came from years of running long distances in bad weather rather than lifting weight in a gym. She had a small scar above her left eyebrow that she never explained and nobody asked about more than once. She'd been with the unit for 6 months, transferred from a special reconnaissance element that had been quietly dissolved following a mission that nobody discussed in any official briefing. "It's against procedure," Ramsey said. "I know. You're going to roll over and drive that stock into your sternum at 3 in the morning and wake the entire tent up." "I won't roll over." "How do you know?" "I don't roll," she said simply, like that was just a fact about herself, like the weather. Ramsey exhaled slowly through his nose. He glanced at the other cots. Across the tent, Specialist Tavio Grant had cracked one eye open and was watching the exchange with the expression of a man who had already placed a bet on how it ended. 2 cots over, Corporal Becca Leith hadn't moved, but her breathing had changed. She was awake. They were all awake. "Command finds out you're sleeping with a loaded weapon." "It's not loaded," Mara said. "Magazine's in my boot." Ramsey blinked. He hadn't expected that. He wasn't sure whether it made things better or worse. "Why?" he said finally, the word coming out less like a question and more like a door being pushed open. "Do you sleep with your rifle, Voss?" She didn't answer right away. She looked at the ceiling of the tent, where the canvas bowed slightly under the weight of accumulated snow. Then she said, "Because I want to know where it is the second I need it." Your weapon is 2 feet from your cot, like every other soldier in this tent. 2 feet is far when it's dark and someone is shooting. The tent was quiet. The generator coughed somewhere outside. Ramsey looked at her for another moment. Then he turned around and walked back to his end of the tent without another word. Behind him, Tavio Grant closed his eye. Becca Leith went back to pretending she was asleep. And Mara Voss lay on her back with her rifle against her chest, staring at the curved canvas ceiling, listening to a silence that had something wrong buried deep inside it. The camp had been at Black Ridge Valley for 11 days. The mission was straightforward on paper. Maintain observation of the northern approach routes, support a larger reconnaissance effort running parallel through the adjacent valley, and act as a tripwire in the event of hostile movement through the gorge. 3 four-man fire teams, 1 signal specialist, 1 combat medic, and a forward observer, 16 people total. Lieutenant Ethan Cross commanding. Cross was 32, West Point trained, and the kind of officer who read his field manuals the way other men read scripture, with total faith and minimal tolerance for improvisation. He was not a bad officer. He was meticulous about equipment checks, serious about patrol spacing, firm about rotation schedules. His soldiers were well rested and properly fed, which was more than could be said for a lot of forward elements operating in these mountains. What Cross lacked, and what Mara had clocked within her first 48 hours at the base, was the ability to listen to information that didn't come through official channels. He trusted sensors. He trusted satellite imagery. He trusted the radio reports that came down the chain every morning at 0600 and every evening at 1800. He did not trust instincts, particularly not Mara's. She'd raised her first concern on day 4. They were standing outside the command tent during an equipment review, the kind of routine inspection that Cross ran with clockwork regularity. The temperature was somewhere around -15, and everyone was doing that slight full-body lean into the wind that you stop noticing after the first week. "Sir," Mara said, "I want to talk about the eastern approach." Cross didn't look up from his clipboard. "What about it?" "The patrol route swings too wide. If someone wanted to use the gorge at the base of Ridge 7, they'd have a 12-minute window where nobody could see them. The gorge is covered by the sensor package. The sensor package is motion-based. If movement is slow enough, the sensor package is calibrated for this environment, Voss. Command signed off on the placement." "Yes, sir." She waited a beat. "But the snow along the east side of the gorge has been settling in a specific pattern. Winds coming from the northwest, so anything moving along the eastern edge would be sheltered. No drift disruption." Cross looked up then. He had sharp blue eyes and a way of looking at you that felt more like assessment than attention. "You've been watching the snow." "Yes, sir." "The snow." "Snow remembers where weight has been, sir. You look at it long enough." "I'm going to stop you there." He set the clipboard down against his thigh. "The sensor package is active. The patrol routes are consistent with doctrine. I don't adjust mission parameters based on snow analysis." He said the last 2 words with a precision that was almost surgical. "We clear?" "Yes, sir." She walked away. Ramsey had been standing close enough to hear. He fell into step beside her. "You could have framed that better," he said quietly. "Probably." "He doesn't hate you, Voss. He just doesn't know you yet." She looked at him sideways. "How long before he figures it out?" Ramsey didn't answer, which was itself an answer. The dogs were the second sign. The camp had 2 military working dogs, Axel and Brix, both Belgian Malinois, both attached to the handler Corporal Pete Dunn, who was the most relaxed person in the entire unit and kept a photo of his golden retriever taped above his cot in what everyone agreed was a very specific kind of irony. Axel and Brix were alert dogs, trained primarily for perimeter detection. They worked a rotation with the guard posts, cycling through smell cone sweeps that covered a significant portion of the northern and eastern approaches. They were, in theory, an excellent early warning system. In practice, they barked at everything: the wind, the generator, the sound of a cookpot being set down too hard, a soldier coughing too close to the perimeter. On day 6, Axel had spent 40 minutes barking at a pine branch that had broken under ice and fallen against the outer wire, and the entire camp had gone to half alert before Dunn finally figured it out and ended the incident with visible embarrassment. So when both dogs went completely silent on the evening of day 9, nobody noticed. Nobody except Mara. She was on the early watch rotation. 2000 to 2200, and she was positioned at the eastern observation post when she realized she couldn't hear Axel or bricks. She'd been half listening to them as background noise, the way you listen to traffic when you live near a highway, constant and therefore invisible, until it stops. The silence lasted 11 minutes. Then Axel started up again briefly and went quiet. When Dunn came by to relieve her at 2200, she mentioned it. They went quiet around 2045, she said. Both of them. 11 minutes. Dunn thought about it. He had a large, unhurried face and a habit of chewing the inside of his cheek when he was working something through. Wind changed around then, he said. Sometimes they lose a scent and freeze up while they're reacquiring. Both at the same time. Happens. For 11 minutes? He chewed his cheek. I'll watch them tonight. She nodded and stepped back toward the main camp. She almost said more. She almost explained what she thought the silence meant, that something or someone had moved upwind of the dogs at exactly the right moment, disrupting their scent picture, creating a gap in the perimeter awareness that lasted just long enough to be useful to someone who knew the patrol patterns. But she'd already raised one concern with Cross that week, and she'd seen how that landed. So she went back to her tent. She checked her rifle. She checked the field of view from her cot through the narrow gap at the base of the tent flap. She lay down, pulled the rifle close, and tried to sleep. She didn't sleep. The radio was the third sign. It started on day 10. Small bursts of static on the primary communications frequency, irregular and brief, the kind of thing that could easily be atmospheric interference or equipment degradation or simply the mountains playing their usual games with signal propagation. The signal specialist, a young woman named Torres, logged it and ran a diagnostic. The diagnostic came back clean. She checked the antenna array, found nothing wrong, and filed a report noting possible environmental factors. Cross reviewed it and marked it satisfactory. But Mara had spent 2 years in a reconnaissance unit where half their work involved signals intelligence at the operational edge. She knew what environmental static looked like: the long, rolling, semi-random noise of ionospheric bounce, the crackle and fade of a system reaching its range limit. What she heard on the radio wasn't that. It was short, controlled, appearing in clusters of 3 or 4 bursts, then nothing for 30 minutes, then another cluster. The pattern wasn't regular enough to be mechanical. It was irregular in a very deliberate way, like someone had specifically designed it to look accidental. She went to Torres directly, keeping Cross out of it. "Those static hits on primary," she said. "Can you pull the timing logs?" Torres was 24, competent, and slightly intimidated by Mara in the way junior soldiers are sometimes intimidated by people with unclear pasts and clear eyes. She pulled up the logs on her equipment. Mara looked at them for a long time. "They're clustered," she said. "Yeah, but 3-4 hits, 30-minute gap, 3-4 hits again, since yesterday morning." Torres looked at the log. Her face changed slightly. "That's consistent." "Yeah, it could be a lot of things," Mara said. She straightened up. "Is there any way to determine the direction of origin?" Torres hesitated. The equipment they had wasn't really set up for that. Direction finding required a different antenna configuration and generally more space and more time than a forward operating base in a frozen mountain valley typically provided. "Not with what we've got here." "Okay." Mara looked at the logs one more time. "Log it with the time signatures, specifically the clustering pattern." "Should I report it to Lieutenant Cross?" Mara thought about this. "It's already logged. He'll see it on the morning report." She walked back to her tent. She found Ramsey sitting on a crate outside, drinking from a battered metal mug, watching the darkness in the way men watch things when they're thinking rather than looking. "Ramsey," she said. "Voss?" "Third anomaly in 2 days." He looked at her over the rim of his mug. He'd heard about the dogs. He'd heard about the snow. Now she was apparently adding something else. "Tell me." She told him about the radio clusters. She kept it brief, just facts, no interpretation until the end. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd come to appreciate about him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You think someone's doing recon?" "I think the pattern is consistent with a team moving in stages, stopping to transmit status, moving again. Based on static bursts on a forward base radio. Based on that, plus the dogs going quiet, plus the snow compression pattern on the east slope." Ramsey set his mug down slowly. I was a big man, wide through the shoulders, with hands that looked like they'd been designed for a different, heavier purpose. And when he sat still like this, he had a kind of deliberate weight to him, like a stone that had chosen its location carefully. He looked at her for a long time. I hear you, he said finally, but I need more than pattern recognition before I go to Cross with something that's going to change his operational posture. He wasn't dismissing her. She could hear that. He was being precise. You understand what I'm saying? I understand. What would more look like? In your head. Mara thought about it. Compression in the snow along the eastern gorge. Something too regular to be wind or animal movement. Something that looks like it was smoothed over. When would you check? Tomorrow morning, early. He nodded slowly. All right. He picked his mug back up. Don't go alone. Bab. Chateauctavio Grant. He was from New Orleans originally. Broad smile, easy manner, the kind of soldier who made hard days feel slightly less hard just by existing in them. He was also quietly excellent in the field, which Mara had noticed within her first week. He could move through rough terrain without making noise, and he had a hunter's patience that most soldiers either had or didn't, and training didn't really install. They left at 0545, just before full light, telling Ramsey where they were going and nobody else. The air outside the camp was brutal, not just cold but aggressive, the kind of cold that got into the gaps between your gear and worked on the exposed skin systematically. The snow was fresh from the night before, 8 centimeters on top of the existing pack. They moved east, following the tree line, keeping low, taking 15 minutes to cover a distance they could have walked in 3. Grant moved without being told to. He matched her pace, her posture, the specific rhythm of stop and listen that she'd adopted. He didn't talk. He watched. The gorge was a narrow channel cut into the base of Ridge 7, maybe 20 meters across at its widest, flanked on both sides by rock faces that rose quickly into timber. In summer, it was probably a drainage path. In winter, it was a compressed corridor of ice and shadow that funneled wind through it like a slow exhale. Mara stopped at the gorge's western entrance. She looked at the snow. Grant looked at the snow. Then Grant looked at Mara. Somebody's been here, he said. Not a question. The snow along the eastern wall of the gorge had been disturbed and then carefully, not perfectly, but carefully, smoothed back. It was the kind of repair job that works from a distance and fails up close. She could see where individual boot impressions had been brushed out but not fully erased, where the compression beneath was still visible as slight depressions that didn't match the natural wind drift pattern around them. She crouched down. She was counting the impressions, trying to get a sense of how many people had moved through. 4, she said quietly. Maybe 5. Moving single file. Direction? She traced the line with her eyes. South-southwest, toward the supply route. Grant straightened slowly. His easy manner had gone somewhere. What replaced it was simpler and harder. When? 12 hours ago, maybe 14. She stood, fresh enough that the smoothing isn't fully settled yet. We need to report this. Yeah. She took 3 photographs with the compact camera she carried, making sure to capture the scale by placing her gloved hand at the edge of the frame. Then she and Grant moved back to camp the same way they'd come. Careful, slow, no shortcuts. She reported directly to Ramsey. Ramsey looked at the photographs and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, I'll set up the meeting with Cross. The meeting with Cross happened at 0900 in the command tent. He listened. He looked at the photographs. He reviewed the radio log Torres had printed out. He sat across the folding table from Mara with his hands flat on the surface and his expression carefully neutral. When she finished, he was quiet for a beat. You and Grant left the perimeter without authorization, he said. Ramsey knew where we were going, sir. Ramsey is not the authorizing officer. He looked at her steadily. I am. Yes, sir. Everything you're presenting is circumstantial. The snow could have been disturbed by animals. The radio interference has an environmental explanation on file. The dogs... Sir, Mara said, with respect, I've worked surveillance operations for 2 years. The clustering pattern on those transmissions isn't random, and the smoothing on that snow was done by a human being with a tool or a glove. Animals don't smooth their tracks. Cross looked at her. He had the particular expression of a man who is finding something harder to dismiss than he wanted to. "What are you asking for, Sergeant?" "Change the watch rotation to include the eastern gorge. Add a sensor at the mouth of the gorge. Move the response team to a higher readiness posture tonight and tomorrow night." He considered this. "You're asking me to restructure tonight's operation based on evidence that isn't confirmed. I'm asking you to prepare for a possibility that the evidence is pointing toward." The silence in the command tent lasted several seconds. "I'll review the sensor placement options," Cross said finally. His voice was flat. "The watch rotation stays as is pending further information. You are not to conduct unauthorized reconnaissance outside the perimeter again." "Understood, sir." She stood. She turned to go. "Voss!" His voice caught her at the tent entrance. She stopped. "This conversation doesn't leave this tent." She looked back at him. "No, sir." She stepped outside. The cold hit her face immediately. Ramsey was waiting 10 feet away, and he read her expression without asking. And then he looked away into the middle distance, jaw set, thinking through something she couldn't see. That night, the temperature dropped another 6 degrees. Mara cleaned her rifle with the methodical care she'd learned to give it regardless of whether she thought she'd need it, because the point was never whether you thought you'd need it. She field stripped it, wiped every surface, ran a bore brush twice through the barrel, reassembled it in the dark because she did it often enough now that the dark didn't matter. She loaded the magazine. She seated it. She removed it again and put it in her boot. She lay down. She pulled the rifle against her chest. Around her, the camp went through its nighttime rhythms. The watch change at 2200, the generator cycling, the distant sound of one of the cooks from the next tent talking in his sleep, words she couldn't make out, just the cadence of speech in a dream. The silence outside was total, too total. Mara's eyes stayed open. She was watching the tent wall where a thin line of darkness showed through the gap in the canvas at floor level, a sliver of the frozen world outside that shifted almost imperceptibly as the wind moved. At 02177, the sliver of darkness changed. The wind stopped moving it. Something had stepped between the tent and the wind. Mara's hand found her boot, found the magazine. She sat up without making a sound, and in the darkness of the tent she seated the magazine with a single quiet, precise click, and the sound was soft enough that nobody stirred, but her eyes were already moving toward the tent opening and she was already reaching for her boots with her other hand. And then, from somewhere beyond the eastern wire, a branch cracked. Not wind, not snow weight. Weight. The crack lasted less than a second, but Mara was already moving. She came off the cot in a single fluid motion, boots half-laced, rifle in her right hand, sling looped over her forearm before she'd fully straightened. The tent was dark except for the faint ambient light bleeding through the canvas from the camp's perimeter lights. Enough to see shapes, not details. Enough to navigate without tripping. She crossed the tent in 4 steps and pressed herself against the canvas beside the entrance flap, not touching it, just listening. Behind her, she heard Tavio Grant sit up. She held up a fist without turning around. "Stop." He stopped. She listened. The camp outside was performing its usual 0200 rhythms. The distant generator, the low wind, the creak of the antenna array cable moving against its mount. Normal sounds. Expected sounds. The sounds of a forward base in a frozen valley doing what forward bases do in the middle of the night. But underneath all of it, threading through it like a wire she could feel more than hear, was the specific quality of silence that meant something living was holding very still. She'd been in enough country to know the difference. Animals fidgeted. Animals breathed audibly in cold air, their breath visible even at distance. Animals, when they stopped moving, still generated the small, irregular sounds of a living thing, a shift of weight, a nostril flare, claws finding purchase on ice. What she was hearing was the silence of something that had been trained not to move. Grant was beside her now, boots on, weapon up, because he was good and he'd read the situation without needing it explained. She pointed 2 fingers toward the eastern wall of the tent. He nodded. She pointed at herself, then at the tent entrance. He nodded again. She pulled the tent flap back 2 inches. Cold air hit her face like a wall. She looked through the gap. The perimeter wire ran 30 meters out from the tent line, and the space between was empty ground crossed by packed snow pathways, and the occasional equipment cache covered in white tarps. The perimeter lights were set low, Enough to see the wire, but not enough to kill night vision at the guard posts. Standard setup. 2 of the perimeter lights on the eastern side were out. Mara stared at this for a half second. They had been on at midnight. She knew because she'd looked. She let the tent flap close. She turned to Grant. "Eastern lights are down," she breathed. The words barely moved air. His eyes went sharp. She crossed back to Ramsey's cot in 3 steps and put her hand on his shoulder. He was the kind of man who came awake clean. No noise, no disorientation, just a rapid inventory of where he was and what was needed. "Sit rep," he said. 1 word, barely louder than thought. Eastern perimeter lights out, unidentified weight contact beyond the wire. 12 meters, maybe 15. Ramsey was already swinging his legs off the cot. "You're sure about the weight contact?" Branch snap, single source. Too heavy for wind, too deliberate for settling snow. He was pulling on his jacket. "How many?" "Unknown. At least 1. He looked at her. A fast, precise look that was doing rapid calculations she could almost see running behind his eyes. Then he reached for his radio, set it to the guard post frequency, and keyed it once. 2 clicks. The prearranged signal for possible contact, stand by. The response came back immediately. 2 clicks from the south post. 1 click, then a pause, then 1 click from the east post, which meant the east post guard had heard something too and was currently watching it. Ramsey keyed twice more. "Hold position. Report." The radio crackled. Then the East Post Guard's voice came through, barely above a whisper. "Movement. Eastern Gorge, base of the ridge. Can't get a count. At least 3. The tent was now fully awake. Every soldier in the space had come upright with the particular silence of people who've rehearsed this moment enough times that the body does it before the mind finishes deciding. Nobody spoke. Nobody reached for lights. Weapons came up, gear was pulled on, and the tent transformed in under 40 seconds from a sleeping space into something else. Mara was already at the entrance. "Voss," Ramsey said, not stopping her, just acknowledging. She slipped outside. The cold was savage and immediate. -19 now, maybe colder, and the wind had the particular efficiency of mountain air that had been traveling a long way before it arrived, and had not spent that journey warming up. She pressed herself against the outer tent wall and gave herself 15 seconds to let her eyes fully adjust. The camp was 40 meters wide at its broadest point. The command tent was centered. The comms tent was northeast. Guard posts at 4 compass points, north, south, east, and a 4th positioned at the supply route entrance to the south-southwest. The Eastern Gorge entrance was beyond the wire, beyond the cleared ground, at the base of the ridge that rose steeply into darkness. She moved south along the tent line, keeping the structures between herself and the eastern wire. The 2 dead perimeter lights created a specific shadow pattern, a roughly rectangular absence of illumination that ran from the northeast corner of the wire to a point about 8 meters south of it. In the middle of that shadow, something was moving. Mara stopped. She brought the rifle up. Her scope had a modest night enhancement capability. Not true thermal, not image intensification, but a glass quality and objective lens size that let in significantly more ambient light than the naked eye. She looked through it. The shadow resolved into shapes, 4 of them, low to the ground, moving with the specific compressed economy of people who had been trained to reduce their profile in open terrain. They were wearing white over gray, improvised winter camouflage, not the kind that came from a supply chain, but the kind that got sewn by hand from whatever materials were available. Effective in this environment, very effective. They were moving in a single file toward the southern section of the wire, toward the supply route. She tracked them. 1, 2, 3, 4. She looked for a 5th, nothing. She looked for a 6th, nothing. 4 people moving deliberately, carrying equipment she could see but not identify clearly at this range and in this light. They were maybe 60 meters from the wire. Her finger was outside the trigger guard. She thought about what a shot would do. A shot would wake the camp. A shot would initiate contact. In a contact situation at 0200, with unknown enemy strength and no confirmed count beyond these 4, with a camp that was half in reactive mode and half still untangling from sleep, a shot meant chaos. It meant the 4 she could see going to ground and the unknown additional elements she couldn't see using the chaos as cover. She thought about Cross's sensor package, which was covering the northerner approach, not the Eastern Gorge, because the Eastern Gorge was 12 minutes outside the patrol window. She thought about the smooth snow she'd photographed that morning. 4. Moving toward the supply route. If they cut the supply route, she moved her aim off the figures. She brought the crosshairs to the snow 6 feet ahead of the lead figure, where a clear patch of ground reflected what little ambient light there was. She exhaled slowly. She fired. The suppressed round cracked through the darkness. Not silent, suppressors never are, but dramatically reduced, the mechanical snap of the action louder than the muzzle signature. The snow in front of the lead figure erupted in a white burst that scattered across 2 meters of ground, and the effect was instantaneous and total. All 4 figures dropped flat. And then the camp woke up. Not the gradual, confused waking of people who don't know what they're responding to. This was the specific, trained response of soldiers who had been in various stages of alert for the past 4 minutes. The guard post came up. Ramsey's voice on the radio was sharp and controlled. Lights came on along the northern wire. The wrong side initially, then correcting. Boots hit ground. The response team poured out of the southern tent already in kit. The chaos lasted 90 seconds, but the 4 figures in the snow had been pinned by it, flat, not knowing if they'd been spotted or if the shot was a stray round or if the camp was now engaging. And those 90 seconds were exactly enough time for the guard post to reorient and for Ramsey to get eyes on the eastern wire. East wire, 4 contacts, prone 60 meters, the guard post called on radio. Hold fire, Ramsey said. Illuminate. The floodlights on the eastern posts came on. The 4 figures were gone. In the space of the illuminate command and the execution, they'd moved. Back toward the gorge, fast and low, abandoning their approach with the efficiency of people who had a rehearsed contingency for exactly this outcome. By the time the light hit the ground, there was only churned snow and the receding impression of people who had been and were no longer there. Mara lowered her rifle. Behind her, she heard Boots. Ramsey, moving up beside her, his breath coming fast. He looked at the empty snow where the figures had been. He looked at her. "Did you engage?" he said. "No. I heard a shot. I fired at the snow." Ramsey stared at her. "In front of them," she said. 6 feet in front of the lead element, to stop them and trigger the camp response without initiating a firefight in the dark with unknown strength. He was very still for a moment. "You fired at the snow," he said, repeating it. Not angry, processing. The alternative was engaging 4 confirmed contacts with unknown reinforcement and no established support lines, in the dark, with the camp half awake. She paused. "I chose the option that resolved the immediate threat without committing to a firefight we weren't positioned for." Ramsey looked at the snow. He looked at the gorge entrance where the darkness swallowed everything beyond 30 meters. He looked at Mara. "How many?" he said. 4 confirmed. Possible additional elements in the gorge. He keyed his radio. "Command, this is Ramsey. Possible hostile approach team. 4 confirmed contacts, now withdrawn toward eastern gorge. Need cross on the line now." 30 meters away, the command tent's light came on. Mara stood in the cold and watched the gorge entrance. Her rifle was down. Her breathing was steady. The adrenaline that had been running through her since the branch snap was still there, but organized now, manageable, channeled into the specific focus of watching a piece of ground that she was not going to look away from until someone told her to. Behind her, the camp was moving. Voices, radio traffic, the sound of the response team fanning out along the wire in the standard contact protocol. And then, from somewhere deep inside the eastern gorge, she heard something that nobody else heard. A radio click. Single. Brief. Not random static. Acknowledged. She didn't say anything. She didn't move. She just marked it in the part of her mind where she kept the evidence, beside the snow compression and the dog silence and the clustered transmissions and the smooth tracks. Someone in that gorge had just reported back. And whoever they'd reported back to was listening. The single radio click from the gorge dissolved into the wind and left nothing behind. No follow-up, no voice, no movement at the tree line. Just the compressed silence of a mountain valley that had swallowed whatever it wanted to swallow and wasn't giving it back. Mara stood at the wire for another 4 minutes, watching the gorge entrance, before Ramsey's hand appeared on her shoulder and he said, quietly, "Come inside." She didn't argue. There was nothing left to see. The debrief happened at 0300 in the command tent, which was too small for the number of people Cross had pulled into it. Ramsey stood to the left. Torres was wedged against the equipment rack with her arms crossed. Grant leaned against the center pole with his jaw tight. The response team leader, Sergeant First Class Wade Hooper, stood directly across from Cross with the expression of a man who had run out into the cold for nothing and was working hard not to say so. Cross stood at the folding table with the map spread in front of him and his hands flat on the surface, and he looked like someone who had been given information he didn't want and was deciding what to do with it. "Walk me through the shot," he said. He was looking at the map, not at Mara. She walked him through it. 4 contacts, white over gray camouflage, single file, moving toward the supply route, her decision to fire at the snow rather than engage directly. The subsequent withdrawal of the contacts into the gorge. When she finished, Cross was quiet for a moment. "You discharged your weapon," he said, "without authorization." "There wasn't time to request authorization, sir." "There's always time to—" "Sir?" Ramsey's voice was flat and measured. She made a tactical decision under time pressure. "We can debate the protocol after we figure out what just tried to walk through our wire." Cross looked at Ramsey. Something passed between them that wasn't quite disagreement and wasn't quite agreement, but existed somewhere in the compressed space between 2 men who respected each other enough to push back. 4 contacts, Cross said. He looked back at the map. "You're certain?" 4 confirmed, Mara said. "Possible additional elements in the gorge." I heard a radio click from that direction approximately 90 seconds after the withdrawal. 1 click. Single transmission, short, consistent with a status report. Hooper shifted his weight. "Could have been static." "It could have been," Mara said. "It wasn't." Hooper looked at her with the specific expression of a man who had been in the Army for 14 years and was not interested in being corrected by someone whose record he hadn't personally vouched for. "How do you know the difference?" "Because static is random, and that wasn't." The silence in the tent had a texture to it. Cross tapped the map. "The gorge entrance is outside our current sensor coverage." "Yes, sir," Torres said carefully. "We discussed moving a unit to—" "I'm aware of what we discussed." He looked at Mara. "You're suggesting this is a reconnaissance element, possibly advance unit for a larger force." "I'm suggesting the pattern is consistent with that," she said. "The radio clusters over the past 2 days, the track smoothing in the gorge. Tonight's approach toward the supply route." She paused. "They weren't trying to breach the wire. They were measuring the response time." The room was quiet. "Measuring it," Cross said. "They wanted to see how long it took us to respond to a contact at the eastern wire, what our coverage looked like, where our lights were positioned." She watched him process this. The approach was too slow and too visible for a genuine breach attempt. They stopped the moment there was a shot, even a suppressed one at distance. A real breach team pushes through the first contact. Cross straightened up. He clasped his hands behind his back, which was a posture Mara had come to associate with him making decisions he wasn't fully comfortable with. "We'll add a sensor to the gorge entrance," he said. "Effective first light. I want a full sweep of the eastern approach at 0600 by a 4-man team, full kit. Hooper, you'll lead that." He looked at Mara. "You'll accompany Hooper's team as a technical advisor. You do not carry the lead. You do not make independent decisions in the field. You advise. Clear?" "Clear, sir?" "The unauthorized discharge goes in my report. I won't recommend action, but it goes in." "Understood, sir." "Everyone get 2 hours if you can. We reconvene at 0530. He looked around the tent. "Nobody talks to the attached elements about what happened tonight. Not until I've reported up the chain and received guidance." People began moving toward the exit. Mara was almost out when Cross said her name. She turned. He waited until the others had cleared the tent. Then he looked at her across the folding table, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Black Ridge Valley, his expression was something other than carefully managed neutrality. "What unit were you with?" he said. "Before the transfer." "3rd Reconnaissance, sir." "What happened to 3rd Recon?" She held his gaze. "It was dissolved." "I know it was dissolved. I'm asking what happened." The lantern between them made a small sound as the wind moved outside. Mara didn't look away. "That's above my pay grade to explain, sir." Cross looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked down at the map. "Dismissed." She stepped outside into the dark. 2 hours of attempted sleep produced nothing useful for most of the camp, and about 40 minutes of something close to genuine rest for Mara, which was enough. She'd functioned on less. She'd learned years ago that the body was more forgiving of sleep deprivation than the mind believed, and that the mind's complaints about exhaustion were mostly negotiable. She was at the eastern observation post before first light, watching the gorge entrance in the gray pre-dawn period when the world existed in shapes rather than details. The temperature had come up 2 degrees from its overnight low, which still left it somewhere that a person without gear would stop functioning within 20 minutes. Grant found her there at 05:5. He handed her a metal mug without saying anything. She took it. It was coffee. The bad kind, the forward base kind that tasted like it had been brewed in a previous geological era. But it was hot, and that was what mattered. They stood together in silence for a while, watching the gorge. 4 of them, Grant said eventually. 4 confirmed. In that camouflage. In that cold. He drank from his own mug. These aren't amateurs. No. So why walk straight at a lit perimeter? They didn't walk straight at it. They moved along the shadow line created by the 2 lights they'd already taken out. Grant looked at her. When did they take out the lights? Before I came outside. The lights were on at midnight. I verified that during the watch handoff. By 02:17, they were out. So somewhere in that window, someone got close enough to disable them without triggering the dogs or the East Coast Guard. The dogs, Grant said slowly, were quiet again tonight. For about 8 minutes around 0200. She drank her coffee. Dunn logged it as wind shift. Grant was quiet. He looked at the gorge. He looked at his coffee. He had the expression of a man who was revising several assumptions simultaneously and not entirely enjoying the process. So there was at least one additional element, he said, beyond the 4. At minimum 1, possibly 2. Close enough to the dogs to disrupt their scent picture, and close enough to the perimeter lights to disable them without being detected. She paused. Which means they know our patrol timing, our light placement, our dog rotation. They've been watching us. They've been watching us for at least 3 days. Grant turned to look at her fully. In the gray pre-dawn light, his face was hard to read, but she could see the calculation running behind his eyes. The same calculation she'd been running since day 9. The pieces adding up to something that was larger and more organized than a random reconnaissance contact. Why haven't you told Ramsey all of this? He said. I told him what I could prove. And this? This is inference. Feels pretty solid to me. Feels solid and is solid are different things in a command tent at 3 in the morning. She finished her coffee. Cross needs something he can put in a report that goes up the chain. He needs coordinates, evidence, confirmed threat assessment, not a marksman reading snow and counting dog silences. Grant looked at the gorge. What do you think they're after? She had thought about this. She'd thought about it for most of the 40 minutes she'd spent not quite sleeping. The supply route, she said. Not to cut it, not yet. To understand it, the timing, the vehicle patterns, the choke points. She paused. They're building a targeting package. Grant didn't say anything for a moment. That's a long game play, he said finally. Yes. Which means they're not going away. No. The first real light of dawn began separating the ridge from the sky above it. The gorge entrance emerged from the gray and gradual definition. Rocks, timber, the compressed corridor of ice and shadow that ran back into the mountain. Nothing moved in it, nothing visible. But Mara had stopped trusting visibility 2 days ago. Hooper's sweep team assembled at 0600 with the efficiency of a unit that had done this enough times that the preparation was muscle memory. 4 soldiers in full kit, weapons hot, moving in a standard 2x2 formation with Hooper at the lead left and his most experienced man, Corporal Delgado, at the lead right. Mara fell in at the rear right, which was where Hooper had positioned her and which suited her because it gave her a field of view across the entire formation. They moved out the east gate and into the cleared ground beyond the wire. The dawn light was still thin and directional, casting long shadows off every surface irregularity in the snow. This was actually useful. Long shadows in flat terrain exaggerated small variations in surface elevation, which meant compression marks and track disturbances were more visible now than they would be in 2 hours when the sun climbed. Hooper moved well. She'd expected him to be the kind of senior NCO who confused experience with infallibility, but he was deliberate in the field, careful about spacing, and he stopped twice in the first 100 meters to observe without her prompting. She revised her assessment of him upward. They reached the gorge entrance in 12 minutes. Hooper held up a fist and the formation went still. He looked at the snow along the gorge walls, then back at Mara. "What am I looking for?" She moved up beside him and pointed. "There, along the base of the eastern wall. See where the surface texture changes?" He looked. "Smoother. Wind-drift snow has a ripple to it. That section is flat. Someone pressed it down and then smoothed the surface." Hooper crouched. He looked for a long time, then, "How far in?" "Unknown." He looked at Delgado. Something passed between them in the way of men who've worked together long enough that communication is mostly eye contact and small movements of the chin. "We go in 20 meters, Hooper said. You stay at the entrance." Mara didn't argue. This was his operation. The team moved into the gorge. She watched from the entrance, her rifle up, covering the ridgeline above them. The gorge narrowed quickly. Within 10 meters, the walls were close enough that two people couldn't walk abreast. Hooper's team moved in single file, Delgado watching upward while the other two worked the ground level. They went 20 meters. They stopped. Hooper crouched. He stayed crouched for a long time. Then he stood and signaled the team back. They returned to the entrance in the same careful formation. Hooper's face when he came back out was different. Whatever skepticism had been there before the sweep had been replaced by something more straightforward and less comfortable. "Impressions," he said. "Multiple sets. Someone tried to brush them out but didn't have time to finish." He paused. "Also found a piece of wire, about 4 centimeters, the kind used for field antenna rigging." Mara looked at him. "Yeah," he said. Not to her specifically, to the situation in general. "Yeah." The morning report to Cross happened at 0800. Hooper delivered it himself, which mattered. Cross trusted Hooper in ways he didn't yet trust Mara, and having the same information come from a source he considered reliable changed its weight in the room. Cross listened without interrupting. When Hooper finished, he turned to his map and stood in front of it for almost a full minute without speaking. Then he said, "Torres, get me a line to battalion." Torres moved immediately. "Yes, sir." "Hooper, reinforce the east post. Add a secondary position at the gorge entrance, 2-man team, 4-hour rotations." He turned. "Mara." She straightened. "I want your full assessment in writing. Everything from day 4. The snow observations, the dog behavior, the radio patterns, tonight's contact, everything, with times and coordinates where applicable." He paused. "Battalion is going to want a complete picture." "Yes, sir." "How long?" 2 hours. "You have 90 minutes." She nodded and turned to go. "Voss?" His voice again. She stopped again, which was starting to feel like a pattern. "The 2 lights on the eastern wire. How did they disable them without being detected?" She'd thought about this. High-powered optical disruption, or physical contact during the 0030 guard rotation gap. There's a 4-minute window between the north post completing its sweep and the east post restarting its round. If someone knew that timing, they'd have 4 minutes at the wire. "Yes, sir." Cross looked at the map. "The timing of our rotations is documented in the operational order, sir, which goes to battalion every week." The silence in the command tent was specific and heavy. "Write the assessment," Cross said quietly. 90 minutes. She wrote it in the comms tent because it was the only space with a working heater and a table long enough to spread her notes. Torres gave her a corner and stayed out of her way, which Mara appreciated. The written assessment was not something she enjoyed. Writing made her reduce things to language, and some of what she understood about a tactical situation existed in a pre-language register, a kind of spatial and sensory knowledge that didn't fully survive the translation to words. But she did it carefully, methodically, starting from day 4 and working forward, keeping the language precise and factual and stripped of the qualifications she would normally have added to protect herself from being wrong. She was on day 9, the dogs. When Hooper came in, he sat down across from her without asking if it was okay. He put his forearms on the table. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had arrived at a decision. "3rd Recon," he said. She kept writing. "I know a guy who served adjacent to that unit. Not in it. Adjacent." He paused. "He mentioned an operation, Western Corridor, about 3 years ago." She continued writing. He said there was a marksman on that operation who made a shot at 400 meters in a crosswind, called it before anyone else even had the target confirmed. He paused again. He remembered the name, said she was the best natural shooter he'd ever seen work a long gun. Mara finished the sentence she was on and set down her pen. She looked at Hooper. He looked back at her. He wasn't asking her to confirm it, he was telling her he knew, which was a different thing. In the military, these were two very different things. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because I gave you a hard time last night in that tent." He said it simply, without apology or performance. "And because I went into that gorge this morning and found what you told Cross was there. What happened to 3rd Recon wasn't—" "I don't need to know what happened to 3rd Recon," he said it firmly, not cutting her off, closing a door she'd been about to open unnecessarily. "What I need to know is whether your read on this situation is right." Mara looked at him. She thought about how to answer that honestly. "I think we have a reconnaissance element that has been building a targeting package on this base for 3 to 4 days," she said. "I think they now have our response time, our sensor coverage gaps, our patrol windows, and our light placement. I think tonight's contact was the last piece of information they needed." She paused. "And I think the next thing that comes through that gorge won't be a 4-man team moving slowly." Hooper sat with this for a moment. "How long do we have? If they're reporting back to a planning element that needs time to reposition? 48 hours. Maybe 72. She picked up her pen. "If they're already positioned and just needed the reconnaissance confirmation? Less." He nodded. He stood up. "Write fast," he said, and walked out. She wrote fast. The assessment landed on Cross's desk at 0927. He read it in 9 minutes, which meant he read quickly and attentively rather than thoroughly, and then he was on the line to battalion for 40 minutes with the door to the command tent closed. When he came out, his face was arranged in the particular way of an officer who has received information that didn't make his situation easier. He called Ramsey. Mara was nearby enough to hear the exchange without being close enough to be part of it, which was an arrangement she'd developed over years of working in units where information traveled in one direction and she was rarely at the receiving end. "Battalion is sending an additional sensor package and a 4-man support element," she heard Cross say. "ETA 36 hours. 36 hours, Ramsey repeated. "Best they can do through the pass with current conditions." A pause. "And in the meantime?" "We hold, we watch, we don't provoke contact unless contacted." Another pause. "Sir, if Voss's read is right, if her read is right, we have 48 hours minimum. Support arrives in 36. He said it firmly, not angrily, firmly the way you say things when you've already processed the math and accepted the discomfort. "We manage what we have." Ramsey said nothing. "Cole." Cross using Ramsey's first name was notable. She'd never heard it before. "I've read her assessment. I've read it twice." He paused. "I'm not dismissing it. I know you're not, sir. But I also can't restructure the entire defensive posture of this base on the analysis of one person who—" He stopped. "Who what, sir?" The silence lasted a beat too long. "Who I don't have a full picture of." Mara moved away from the corner of the tent. She didn't need to hear the rest of it. That afternoon, the temperature dropped again. Not drastically, 3 degrees, maybe 4, but in a sustained, settling way that changed the feel of the air from merely cold to intentionally hostile. The kind of cold that had a direction to it. The sky went from pale gray to a darker, more deliberate gray that meant weather was coming, and coming with commitment. Dunn came to find Mara at the Eastern Observation Post at 1400. He was carrying both dogs. Not literally, but he had them on short leads, one in each hand, and they moved with their heads low and ears working. He looked like a man who wanted to say something and was organizing it. "Hey," he said. "Done." He let Axel sniff the post, then corrected the lead when Axel wanted to continue toward the wire. "I pulled the dog logs from last night." She waited. "They went quiet at 0158 and resumed at 0206, he said. 8 minutes. Consistent with what I saw. The night before, they went quiet at 0213 for about 6 minutes. He paused. The night before that 9 minutes, starting around 0130. Mara looked at him. "I should have caught it sooner," he said. He didn't say it like he was asking for reassurance. He said it like a man stating a fact about himself that he was not happy about. I logged the individual incidents. I didn't look at the pattern. You're looking at it now. Because you said something. He adjusted Brix's lead. The dog was alert, nose working the air toward the gorge. I'm saying something back. Every night for 3 nights, both dogs, same time window, eastern approach. That's not wind shift. No, she said. It's not. He stood there for a moment looking at the gorge. Brix won't point at it directly, but she keeps pulling that direction, has been since yesterday morning. He looked at Mara. She smells something in there. How far can she work a scent in cold air? Clean wind? Half a click, easy. But this gorge channels the air like... He paused. She could be picking up something 300 meters in. 300 meters into the gorge was well beyond where Hooper's team had swept this morning. Report it to Ramsey, she said. Already did. He said he'd pass it to Cross. He started to turn, then stopped. For what it's worth. What you did last night. The shot. He shook his head slightly. I don't know if I would have thought of that. She didn't say anything. That's all, he said, and walked his dogs back toward the perimeter. The afternoon slid toward evening with the particular reluctance of winter light in mountain country, the sun never really showing itself, just a slightly brighter patch of gray sky that faded gradually until you looked up and realized you couldn't see the ridge anymore, and it was already nearly dark. Mara sat on a supply crate outside the main tent line and cleaned her rifle for the second time that day. Not because it needed it, because it gave her hands something to do while her mind worked. She was on the 3rd pass of the boar brush when Ramsey sat down on the crate beside her. He didn't say anything for a while. He had his own weapon across his knees, and he was looking at the eastern tree line with the focused, patient attention of a man who was doing 2 things at once and aware of both. Cross is struggling with you, Ramsey said finally. She ran the brush through again. I know. It's not personal. I know that too. He needs to trust the information, and he needs to trust the source, and right now he's... Ramsey paused. He's working on it. She pulled the brush and examined the patch. What's in my file, Ramsey? He was quiet for a beat. What do you mean? When Cross pulled my record, what does it say about 3rd Recon? Another pause. Longer. It says the unit was dissolved following an operational review. It says you were transferred by request of the reviewing authority. It says your performance rating is exceptional. He paused again. It doesn't say much else. And that bothers him. Gaps in a file bother any good officer. It means something happened that someone decided not to write down. Mara reassembled the rifle. The pieces went together in their familiar sequence, each one finding its place without hesitation. She seated the bolt, checked the action, set the safety. Something happened. You don't have to... A delayed weapon, she said, not looking at him, looking at the rifle in her hands. On an operation, 14 months ago. A team leader reached for his rifle in the dark, and it wasn't where he thought it was. 3 seconds. She paused. 3 seconds is a long time. Ramsey didn't say anything. He lived, she said, but he lost the use of his right hand, and the rest of what happened in those 3 seconds is in a report that apparently doesn't say much. The wind moved through the camp. Somewhere behind them, the generator cycled. That's why you sleep with it, Ramsey said, quietly. Not a question. That's why I sleep with it. He nodded slowly. He looked at the eastern tree line. He said nothing else about it, which was the right response, and she knew it. They sat together in the cold for a few more minutes. Then Ramsey stood, brushed snow off his jacket, and said, Tonight's watch rotation adds a 2nd position at the gorge. You're on 3rd watch, 0200 to 0400 Eastern Post. Understood. He walked away. She stayed on the crate. She held the rifle across her knees the way Ramsey had held his weapon, loosely, familiarly, the way you hold something you've stopped thinking of as an object and started thinking of as an extension of the decision to be ready. The sky above the eastern ridge had gone fully dark. The gorge entrance was a rectangle of deeper black cut into the tree line. Brix's nose was in there somewhere, working a scent that had been in the gorge since before any of them had started paying attention. Whatever had been in that gorge hadn't left. She was certain of that now. And she was equally certain that Cross's 36-hour timeline for the support element, while logistically accurate, was built on an assumption she couldn't verify. that the people in that gorge were working on the same timeline. The first snowflakes of the approaching storm began falling at 1847, light and sparse, drifting sideways in the wind rather than straight down. By 2100, they were no longer sparse. By 2300, the camp was buried in it, and the eastern gorge was invisible behind a white curtain that pressed against the perimeter lights and turned them into soft, useless halos. And Mara was at the eastern post with her rifle and her cold and her certainty, watching a wall of snow that could be hiding anything. At 0147, 13 minutes before she was due to take over the watch, she heard the dogs. Both of them. Not barking. Whimpering. Whimpering was wrong. That was the first coherent thought Mara had when the sound reached her. Not the alarm bark, not the alert series that Axel and Brix used when they'd acquired a scent and wanted their handler to know it, but the low, compressed whimper of animals that had found something they didn't have the language to explain and were frightened by it. Dogs whimpered when they were hurt. They whimpered when they were confused by something that violated their understanding of how the world was supposed to work. They didn't whimper at the wind. She keyed her radio immediately. East post to control. Dog alert, south kennel. Both animals. Audible distress. I need Dunn on the line now. The response came back in 15 seconds. Torres, night watch, her voice tight. Control copies. Dunn's en route to kennel. What's your situation at East Post? Stable. No visual contact. Visibility is approximately 18 meters in current conditions. She was already scanning as she spoke, the rifle up, working the scope left to right across the wall of falling snow. The perimeter lights were doing almost nothing. 18 meters of usable vision on a good pass, less when a gust pushed the snow sideways. Storm's getting worse. Request Ramsey be woken. Copy. Stand by. She didn't stand by. She kept scanning. The snowfall had intensified in the past 2 hours in a way that felt less like weather and more like a decision. The mountains sending something specific and deliberate down into the valley. The wind had changed direction twice since 2100, which disrupted drift patterns and made reading the ground significantly harder. She'd been compensating by focusing on the narrow channels between drifts rather than the drifts themselves, looking for the places where snow should be accumulating but wasn't because something was blocking it. She found one of those places now, 30 meters out, slightly left of the direct gorge approach, where the perimeter light's influence faded into useful shadow. A drift that should have been building against the outer wire was thinner than it should be, and the thinness had a shape to it. Elongated, horizontal, roughly the width of a person lying flat. She looked at it for 3 full seconds. It moved. Not much. The adjustment of a position held too long. A small shift of weight that disturbed the snow surface just enough to be visible to someone who had been watching that exact spot with the specific attention of someone who believed something was there. East Post to control, she said. Her voice was level. I have a possible contact at the wire, single, prone 30 meters, left of axis. I need Ramsey now. The radio crackled. Then Ramsey's voice, not groggy, not transitioning from sleep, just present. Copy. En route. Hold your position. Holding. She didn't take her eye off the shape. The shape didn't move again. But it also didn't resolve into anything innocent. It didn't turn out to be a drift pattern, didn't reveal itself as a piece of equipment that had blown from the camp supply cache, didn't become harmless under continued observation. It stayed exactly where it was and maintained the specific stillness of something that knew it had been close to being seen and was now committed to not moving until the moment it needed to move. Ramsey appeared beside her 2 minutes later. He came up low, keeping the post's wooden wall between himself and the wire. He looked where she was looking. 30 meters, she said quietly. Left of the axis. There's a drift thinning that shouldn't be thinning. I saw movement 3 minutes ago. He brought up his own optic. He looked for a long time. I see the drift irregularity, he said. I don't see movement. It adjusted position. Once. Small. He kept looking. Then he lowered the optic and looked at her sideways. Not dismissing her. Evaluating. You're certain? I'm certain I saw snow surface displacement consistent with weight shift. I'm not certain what caused it. He keyed his radio. Control, this is Ramsey. Wake the camp. Quiet alert. No lights, no noise. Get cross up and get the response team to the south tent standby position. Do not, I say again, do not Activate additional perimeter lighting until I authorize. Torres's voice came back immediately. Copy all. Ramsey looked at the wire. If there's one, there are more. Yes. Where? She'd been thinking about this since the dog sound reached her. The shape at the wire was prone, meaning it was either a breaching element waiting for a signal or a support element providing cover for a main effort happening somewhere else. Given what she knew about how the last approach had been executed, given the 3 days of reconnaissance, given the antenna wire fragment in the gorge, this wasn't a four-man probe. This was something with a structure to it. The gorge, she said. Main effort is coming through the gorge while that element fixes our attention at the wire. The gorge is a choke point. Why send your main effort through a choke point? Because they know we swept it this morning and found the tracks. Their betting will assume they've relocated. She paused. And because the storm has killed our sensor coverage, the motion unit at the gorge entrance is essentially blind in this snowfall. Ramsey was quiet for a moment, processing. Then, if you're right, we have a diversion element at the wire and a main effort we can't see. Yes. And if you're wrong, we respond to the gorge and leave the wire element uncontested. I'm not wrong. He looked at her. In the bad light and the blowing snow, his face was mostly shadow. That's not an answer I can take to Cross. It's the only answer I have. He thought about it. She could see him thinking about it. The particular stillness of a man running scenarios, testing weight, looking for the place where the decision became clear, or at least less unclear. All right, he said. He keyed his radio. Hooper, I need you at the East Post now, full kit. Cross arrived at the East Post 60 seconds before Hooper, which meant he'd been awake already or close to it. He came in low the same way Ramsey had, and he looked at the wire, and he looked at Mara, and he said, with a precision that suggested he was doing significant work to keep his voice level, report. She reported. Concise, sequenced, factual. The dog sound. The drift irregularity. The movement. Her assessment of diversion and main effort. Cross listened. He looked at the wire for 30 seconds. He looked at the gorge direction. You're suggesting we split the response, he said. Send a team to the gorge while we hold the wire element. I'm suggesting the wire element is bait, sir. Their job is to get us to concentrate here while the main effort uses the gorge. If I send a team to the gorge and you're wrong, I've divided my strength against a wire breach. Yes, sir. And if I don't and you're right, then whatever comes through the gorge reaches the supply cache or the comms tent without opposition. Cross looked at the wire one more time. Then he turned to Hooper, who had arrived and was standing slightly back, weapon up, reading the situation without needing it explained. Hooper, take Grant and Delgado to the gorge entrance. Observation only. Do not enter the gorge. You see confirmed contact, you report, and you hold. You do not engage without my authorization. Sir? Hooper was already moving. Ramsey, wire response team on the south side of the perimeter. If that element at the wire moves, I want them contained. Copy. Cross turned to Mara. Something in his expression had changed. Not softened exactly, but shifted, the way a locked door shifts when a key has been correctly inserted and is partway through its turn. You're with me. East Post. Observation. Yes, sir. He looked at the wire again. One question. Sir? The element at the wire. If they're bait, why haven't they moved? Why hold the position in this weather this long? It was a good question. She'd been asking it herself. Because they're professionals, she said, and because the main effort isn't in position yet. Cross absorbed this. He looked at his watch. He looked at the snow. He said nothing else. They waited. 11 minutes of nothing. 11 minutes of wind and snow and the particular compressed quality of waiting that made the inside of your chest feel smaller than it should. Cross stood beside her and watched the wire without speaking. He was very still, the kind of stillness that was trained rather than natural, the stillness of a man who had learned to use patience as a tool and was now deploying it with intention. Mara watched the drift irregularity at 30 meters. It hadn't moved again. The shape was still there, still holding, still committed to its stillness. At minute 12, Hooper's voice came over the radio. Quiet, controlled, the words coming out with the specific compression of a man who is keeping his voice down in a situation that wanted him to raise it. Hooper to control. I have eyes on the gorge. 3. Correction, 4 contacts. emerging from the gorge approximately 60 meters in, moving toward the entrance. They're carrying, stand by. A pause. 5 seconds. 10. They're carrying a crew-served weapon. Looks like a medium machine gun, bipod mounted. They're setting up at the gorge entrance. The radio went silent. Mara and Cross looked at each other. A crew-served weapon at the gorge entrance pointed into the camp was not reconnaissance. It was not a probe. It was a support by fire position. The kind of thing you set up when you needed to pin a defensive position while another element maneuvered. It was the kind of thing you set up when you were done gathering information and had moved to the phase where you used it. Cross keyed his radio. Hooper, do not, I say again, do not let them complete that setup. What is your position? Tree line east of the gorge mouth, approximately 40 meters from the contacts. Can you engage? A pause. Affirm. But sir, I've got 3 rifles against a crew served. If they get that thing operational before I can suppress... Cross looked at Mara. It was not the look of a man asking permission. It was the look of a man who had arrived at the edge of his planning and found someone standing there who had seen this part of the terrain before. How do you stop them from completing that setup? He said. She was already thinking. The gorge entrance, a machine gun team setting up a bipod position. 60 meters from Hooper's element, 40 meters from the tree line. They'd be low, focused on their equipment, in the process of transitioning from movement to firing position. That transition, the moment of maximum focus on the task and minimum attention to the perimeter, was the window. I need to get to the south observation post, she said. The elevation gives me a sight line into the gorge entrance from the left flank. Hooper has them from the right. If I take the gunner and Hooper takes the assistant gunner simultaneously, the weapon is out of action before they finish setup. That's a coordinated shot, in a snowstorm, at night. Yes, sir. The distance from South Obs to the gorge entrance is approximately 230 meters, elevation advantage of about 12 meters. She said it without hesitation because she'd calculated it the first day she'd arrived at the camp, the way she calculated every position relative to every other position, because that was the habit she'd built over years of working in places where knowing distances kept people alive. Cross looked at her for a moment that was longer than it needed to be if the answer was no. Go, he said. She was moving before the word finished. The south observation post was on a rise at the southern perimeter. Not dramatic elevation, just a natural shelf in the terrain that gave it a few meters of height advantage over the surrounding ground. She'd been up there twice since arriving at the camp. She knew the approach. Along the inside of the west tent line, cut right past the equipment cache, up the packed snow path to the post. She ran it in under 2 minutes, which was faster than she should have pushed in that terrain, and she slipped twice on ice beneath the snow and caught herself both times without breaking stride. When she reached the post, the guard, a young private named Esser, turned with his rifle up and then immediately lowered it when he recognized her. Down, she said. Not harshly. Flatly. He went down without question. She got prone at the post's forward edge. She brought the rifle up and settled into it, cheek to stock, the particular physical alignment she'd spent thousands of hours ingraining until it happened without thought. The scope came up. She looked for the gorge entrance through the snow. 230 meters. The snow was falling at an angle, north-northwest wind, consistent since 2100, which meant the drift was predictable, and she could account for it. Temperature somewhere around -20, which affected muzzle velocity by a calculated elevation 12 meters above the target zone, which meant a downward angle that compressed the apparent distance and required a slight hold adjustment. She found the gorge entrance. She found the team, 4 figures. One prone behind the machine gun, bipod legs being pressed into the snow by a second figure who was positioning them with the careful attention of someone who needed them stable before the weapon was any use. A third figure providing security, weapon up, facing the camp. A fourth hanging back, and she couldn't immediately resolve what he was doing. Then she saw the radio handset and understood. Commander. The fourth figure was their element commander, and he was on a radio, and that meant this wasn't a self-contained action. There was someone else, somewhere else, waiting for the word that the support position was established, which meant the wire element was about to move. She keyed her radio. East Post, this is Voss. The wire element is going to move within the next 60 seconds. They're waiting on the gun team. Cross's voice came back immediately. Copy. I have the wire. Focus on your position. She switched channels. Hooper. Go. I'm at South Obs. I have eyes on the gun team. I count 4. Gunner is prone. Assistant is positioning the bipod. Approximately 90 seconds from operational. I see them. I've got the assistant gunner. I've got the gunner. On my mark. She settled her breathing. She found the gunner in the scope, prone, head down, adjusting his grip on the weapon's receiver. He was wearing the same white over gray camouflage from the night before. He was very still. He was very focused on his weapon. She adjusted for the wind. She adjusted for the angle. She put the crosshairs where they needed to be. Ready, Hooper said. The snow fell between her and the target. Each flake moved in the predictable path of the northwest wind. She tracked them. She had the drift. She had the distance. She had the angle. She exhaled halfway. Mark! She fired. The suppressed rifle cracked through the storm. In the same instant, she heard Hooper's weapon, unsuppressed, louder, a sharp report that rolled off the ridge walls and came back as echo. She was already cycling the bolt, already reacquiring through the scope, already assessing. The gunner was down. The assistant was down. The security figure had dropped instantly, trained reaction to contact, going flat, not injured. The element commander had gone flat too, radio in hand, and she could see him moving, saw his head come up, saw him scanning for the shooter direction. He hadn't found her yet. She put the crosshairs on the machine gun's receiver. She fired twice. The weapon jumped and settled and was no longer a machine gun in any functional sense. Hooper, she said. Gun is down. Commander is still active, flat northeast side of the gorge entrance. Security element is flat, same area. Copy. I have visual on both. A pause. They're not moving. They're deciding. She kept watching. The 2 remaining figures, the element commander and the security man, were flat in the snow at the gorge entrance, and they were doing the math that anyone does when they've just taken fire from an unknown position with unknown strength, and their support weapon is gone. It was a simple calculation with a limited number of outputs. The element commander made his. He grabbed his radio and spoke into it. She could see the handset come up, see the short transmission, see it come down. And then both figures were moving, not forward, not toward the camp, but back, retreating into the gorge the way they'd come, low and fast, using the gorge wall as cover. They're withdrawing, she said. Hooper's voice came back. I see it. Let them go? She clicked across his channel. Sir, gorge element withdrawing. Gun team is down. Recommend we let the remaining 2 withdraw. Pursuing into the gorge in this visibility would be their environment, not ours. A pause of 4 seconds. Concur, Cross said. Let them go. Hooper, hold position at the gorge mouth. Report any follow-on movement. Copy. She lay still and watched the gorge until the 2 retreating figures disappeared into the darkness and the snow closed behind them. Then she let herself breathe fully for the first time in several minutes. Behind her, Esser was very quiet. She lowered the rifle. She looked at her hands. They were steady, which was never a given, which was something she checked every time because the day her hands weren't steady was the day everything she relied on herself for became uncertain. Steady. She got to her knees. She looked south toward the wire. East post, she said. Sit rep. Cross's voice. Wire element moved on the gun team's transmission. We had them at the wire when they moved. Ramsey's team engaged. 2 contacts, both down. No casualties our side. She closed her eyes for 1 second. Copy, she said. She opened them again. Voss? Cross said. The radio made his voice flat, stripped of whatever inflection might have been in it. Good shooting. She didn't respond to that. There wasn't anything to say to it that wasn't either too much or not enough. The next 2 hours were the organized chaos of a defensive position that has taken and repelled a contact. The immediate security sweep, the accountability check, the medical assessment of the 2 wire contacts, the evidence collection at the gorge entrance, the encrypted reporting up the chain. Mara moved through all of it as part of the current rather than directing it, doing what she was asked to do when she was asked to do it, and staying out of the way the rest of the time. She went to the gorge entrance with Hooper and Delgado at 03:30. The storm had backed off slightly, still snowing, but the wind had dropped, which meant the falling snow was mostly vertical now, and visibility had opened to 30 meters or more. The machine gun was an older model but well maintained, and the 2 rounds she'd put through the receiver had done exactly what she'd intended. It wasn't destroyed. It could probably be repaired by someone with the right parts and the right time, but it was not going to fire tonight. The gunner and his assistant were both incapacitated. The medical assessment was quick and professional, and she didn't involve herself in it except to verify for the record that she'd had the gunner in her scope and the crosshairs where she'd placed them. Hooper looked at the entry and exit evidence and said nothing for a moment, and then he said, 230 meters, snowstorm, downhill angle, and didn't finish the sentence because the sentence didn't need finishing. Delgado was collecting the antenna wire and the radio handset the element commander had abandoned. He bagged it efficiently, labeled it. I was methodical in the way experienced soldiers become methodical, not because they like process, but because they've learned that the details they collect carefully are the ones that become useful. We'll get a frequency off this, Delgado said. Maybe a unit signature. Good, Hooper said. Mara crouched beside the machine gun and looked at it. It was heavy, crew-served, requiring 2 people to be effective, the kind of weapon you brought to a position you intended to hold. You didn't carry crew-served weapons on reconnaissance missions. You brought them when you intended to use them. When you had a specific target you decided was worth the wait and the risk of moving that weapon to a fixed position. They were going to suppress the camp, she said. Hooper looked at her. Yeah. Not just fix our attention, suppress. Pin everyone inside while a third element hit the supply route. She looked at the gorge. The 4 we saw in the gorge were the support element. The wire team was the diversion. There's a third element we haven't found. Hooper was very still. You think there's a third team? I think you don't set up a crew-served weapon as a support position unless you have something to support. She looked at the gorge again. The gun team's job was to keep our heads down. The wire team's job was to fix our response. The third team's job was to move on the supply route while both of those were happening. The supply route, Hooper said slowly. The pass, 12 kilometers south. She stood. If they had a team already in position at the pass, Hooper was already reaching for his radio. Cross had the same thought 11 minutes later, which was approximately how long it took the information to travel from Mara to Hooper to Ramsey to the command tent. By the time Mara got back to the camp, Cross was on the line with Battalion, and Ramsey was standing outside the command tent in the cold, with his arms crossed, and an expression that belonged to a man who had arrived at a conclusion he didn't like. The pass, she said, stopping beside him. He's reporting it now. How long before Battalion can get eyes on it? Drone coverage is grounded in this weather. Ground patrol from the nearest element is 40 minutes. He looked at her. If there's a team at the pass, they've had since whenever they moved into position to do what they came to do. Can we reach the patrol that uses that route? Is there a vehicle element? There's a supply convoy scheduled for 0600. He paused. Which is in 2 hours and 20 minutes. The cold between them felt suddenly very specific. Call it off, she said. Cross is calling it off. Right now. He rubbed his face with one hand, a gesture she'd never seen from him before, an unguarded moment of exhaustion that made him look briefly like a man rather than a function. If you hadn't flagged the gorge element, the convoy would have driven into a prepared position. She said it without satisfaction. Without anything, really. It was just what would have happened. Yeah. They stood in the cold. The snow was tapering. Above the ridge, the clouds were starting to separate in places, and through those places she could see the very first, very faint suggestion of a sky that was somewhere behind the weather, waiting. They planned this for at least a week, she said. The reconnaissance, the approach routes, the timing, the 3-element coordination. This is not an improvised operation. No. Which means they have a planning cell somewhere, with good intelligence. She paused. About us. Ramsey looked at her. He'd already reached this conclusion. She could see it. The operational order, she said, the one that goes to Battalion weekly, with the patrol timings, the supply convoy schedule. Cross flagged it 2 days ago. He's been running a parallel assessment. And? Ramsey's jaw was tight. And it's above both our pay grades. She absorbed this. The cold was doing what cold always did, finding the gaps, working them, making everything slightly heavier and more difficult than it would be in a warmer world. She was tired. She could feel the weight of the past 4 hours in her legs and across her shoulders, the particular fatigue that came from sustained adrenaline followed by hard physical effort in bad conditions. She was also not finished thinking. The third team at the pass, she said. If they were in position and they heard what happened here, the gunfire, the radio traffic, they'd abort. If they're disciplined, if they have a contingency protocol. She looked toward the south, in the direction of the pass, which was invisible behind 12 kilometers of mountain terrain and darkness. But if they're not certain what happened, if the contact here was confusing enough that they're waiting for confirmation, then they might still be at the pass, or moving toward it. Ramsey looked at her for a long moment. What are you suggesting? She thought about it carefully. She thought about the convoy schedule, about 40 minutes to battalion's nearest ground element, about the specific tactical situation of a team at a mountain pass that might or might not know its operation had failed. I'm suggesting that if someone were to make contact with that team before they reached the pass, or before they completed whatever they were there to do, the window is the next 20 to 30 minutes. She paused. After that, they're either done or gone. Ramsey looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize, the one where he was doing the calculation between what he wanted to do and what he was authorized to do. I'll talk to Cross, he said. He went into the command tent. She stood outside in the thinning snow and waited, watching the clouds separate above the ridge and reveal, gradually, a sky that was beginning to know what direction east was. Ramsey came back out in 4 minutes. Battalion is pushing a fast response element to the pass, he said. 22 minutes out. They want it clear before the convoy. He looked at her. Cross called it in based on your assessment. She nodded. He told Battalion a marksman at the forward position identified a 3-element coordinated assault and disrupted the primary contact. Ramsey paused. He used your name. She looked at him. I'm just telling you what he said, Ramsey said. He wasn't making it into anything. He was just telling her. She looked at the ridge. The first gray light of dawn was beginning to find the snow up there, the very top of the ridgeline catching a brightness that hadn't arrived in the valley yet. It made the ridge look like it was lit from within, which she knew was an optical effect and nothing more, but which was striking anyway. The convoy, she said. It's been called off? Delayed pending the pass clearance. Good. They stood together for a moment. The camp behind them was slowly transitioning from emergency operations back to something that resembled routine. Voices at normal volume, the smell of coffee coming from the cook tent, the systematic sound of equipment being checked and logged and put back in order. Dunn came around the corner of the main tent with both dogs. Axel and Brix were moving normally, heads up, ears working, no longer compressing themselves with whatever had frightened them at 0147. They passed Mara without Dunn prompting them, and Brix made the specific dog decision to stop and press her face briefly against Mara's leg before Dunn gave a quiet correction and she moved on. Mara looked down at the place on her leg where the dog had been. Ramsey was watching this. He said nothing. She picked up her rifle. She checked the action from habit. She looked at the gorge entrance, visible now in the growing light, a fixed rectangle of shadow and rock that looked, in the early gray of a winter morning after a storm, completely still. It would be hours before they knew about the pass, hours before the full picture assembled itself into something Cross could report with confidence up the chain, hours before the analysis and the debrief and the accounting began. But the convoy wasn't moving. The gun at the gorge entrance was broken, the wire element was down, and somewhere in a chain of decisions that had started with a woman sleeping with a rifle and a sergeant stopping to ask her why, something that had been planned carefully and executed almost perfectly had stopped. She didn't feel satisfied by this. She didn't feel much of anything yet, actually. That was normal. The feeling came later when the body caught up with the events, and it came in its own form and on its own schedule. And you didn't get to choose what it was. What she felt right now was cold and tired and clear. The way she always felt after the thing she'd been waiting for finally arrived and was finally over. She looked at the dawn coming up over Black Ridge Valley, and she didn't say anything, and neither did Ramsey, and the camp moved around them like water finding its level after a stone has been dropped in and the ripples have run their course. The battalion fast response element reached the southern pass at 0431. Mara knew this because Torres relayed the radio traffic from the command tent in real time. her voice coming through the camp frequency with the particular controlled neutrality of a signals specialist who had learned that her job was to transmit information accurately and not editorialize about what it meant. The fast response team, 4 vehicles, 12 personnel, had moved through the pass approach in tactical formation and found exactly what Mara had predicted they would find: a prepared position. Snow scraped into a low berm on the western side of the pass road. Spent chemical hand warmers, the kind that lasted 8 hours and were standard cold weather kit for extended static operations. Boot impressions from at least 6 individuals. And a length of date cord, cut, undetonated, still attached to a pair of anti-vehicle mines that had been placed in the road surface and then hastily removed when the team heard the radio traffic change and understood that the operation had failed. The third element had been there, and they had left without finishing what they'd come to do. Mara was sitting on the supply crate outside the main tent when Torres's voice delivered this last piece. She had a coffee she'd gotten from the cook tent that was now barely warm. She drank it anyway. Around her, the camp was doing the slow, methodical work of post-contact operations. Equipment inventory, weapon maintenance, the careful documentation that the Army required after any engagement, which served the dual purpose of creating a record and giving people's hands something to do while their nervous systems finished processing what had happened. Grant came and sat beside her without asking. He had a bandage on his left forearm, minor, a wire abrasion from the perimeter response. And he was favoring it slightly in the way people favor small injuries when the adrenaline recedes and the body starts filing its complaints. "Mine's at the pass," he said. "Yeah." They were going to hit the convoy. That was the plan. He looked at his bandaged arm. He turned it slightly, examining the edge of the dressing with the detached interest of someone inspecting damage to an object rather than to himself. 4 vehicles. Convoy usually runs with what? 8 personnel? 10, 2 drivers, 2 commanders, 6 security. He was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said. Just that. A word that wasn't agreement or acceptance, but the sound of a person absorbing something and deciding where to put it. She understood that sound. She'd made it herself many times, in many different circumstances. You made it when the math became specific rather than abstract, and the specificity required acknowledgement before you could move past it. "You all right?" she said. "Arm's fine." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her sideways. He had the expression of a man who had been asked a direct question by someone who would know if the answer was dishonest. "I'm processing," he said. "That's normal." "Is it normal that the thing I keep thinking about is that the cook is making eggs this morning and I want eggs more than I have ever wanted anything in my life?" She almost smiled. "Yes, that's very normal." He nodded slowly. "Good." He stood up. "You want eggs?" "Yeah," she said. He went to get them. The formal debrief was scheduled for 0900. Cross sent word through Ramsey at 0730 Shurs. All personnel involved in the overnight contact, command tent, full documentation. Mara spent the intervening time writing her portion of the contact report, which required her to account for every round she had fired, the decision basis for each shot, and the observed effect. It was precise, factual work, and she did it with the same care she'd given the assessment the day before, because she understood that these documents would travel up the chain and become part of a larger picture that she would never fully see. She also understood, with the specific self-awareness of someone who had been through post-operation reviews before, that her portion of the contact report was going to generate questions. The kind of questions that got asked in rooms with people who had ranks she'd never see and clearances that weren't on her paperwork. She finished the report at 0845 and brought it to Torres for integration into the command package. Torres took it, scanned the first page, and looked up with the expression of someone who had just read something that surprised them. 230 meters, she said. "In that storm." "Yes." Torres looked at the report again. "With a field rifle, not a dedicated precision system." "The rifle is a dedicated precision system. The platform is just not what people expect when they say that." Torres absorbed this. She was quiet for a moment in the way of someone revising a category in their mind and finding the revision slightly uncomfortable. "Okay," she said. She put the report in the command package without further comment, which was the right response, and Mara appreciated it. The command tent at 0900 held 8 people in a space designed for comfortable occupancy of 5. Cross stood at the head of the folding table. Ramsey was to his left. Hooper was across from Ramsey. Grant and Delgado were at the back, standing. Torres was at the equipment rack with her logs. The battalion liaison officer, a major named Trent, who had come forward on an early vehicle with the first additional personnel, sat at the right end of the table with a notepad and the particular contained attention of someone whose job was to listen to everything and commit to nothing. Mara sat at the left end of the table. Nobody had told her to sit there. She'd come in and found the chair and taken it, which in retrospect was probably a statement of some kind, though she hadn't intended it as one. Cross opened without preamble. We're going to go through the events of the past 18 hours sequentially. I want complete accounts, not summaries. Major Trent is here from battalion to support the after-action process and to facilitate the intelligence assessment. Everything said in this tent goes into the classified record. Clear? Heads moved around the table. Good. He looked at his notes. We begin at 0147 when the dog handler reported audible distress from both military working dogs. Sergeant Voss, you were at the Eastern Post at that time. Walk us through from that point. She walked them through it. She was precise and chronological, and she kept the language factual. She described what she'd observed, what she'd assessed, what she'd communicated, and what she'd done. She did not editorialize. She did not qualify beyond what the facts required. When she got to the shot at the gorge entrance, the 2 rounds through the machine gun receiver, she described the firing solution in specific terms: distance, angle, wind assessment, point of aim, observed effect. When she finished, the tent was quiet for a moment. Major Trent was looking at his notepad. He had written something. The initial shot, he said, the one that disrupted the first approach, the night before. You fired at the snow in front of the approaching element. Correct, sir. Rather than engaging the element directly. Correct. Walk me through that decision. She looked at him. He was in his 40s, lean, with the kind of face that gave nothing away and probably hadn't for years. He wasn't hostile, he was precise, which she could work with. Engaging directly at that distance, in those conditions, at night, with unknown additional elements in the gorge, would have initiated a firefight without established support lines, she said. The camp was partially reactive. A direct engagement might have fixed the 4 confirmed contacts at the wire, while unknown elements in the gorge used the noise and confusion to maneuver. The suppressed round into the snow produced a visual and auditory stimulus that triggered the camp response without committing to a firefight. You assessed that triggering the camp response was more valuable than eliminating the immediate threat. I assessed that the immediate threat was 4 people who were not the primary threat. Yes, sir. Trent made another note. Cross looked at her. The decision to fire without authorization. Yes, sir. The report I filed noted that you discharged without authorization and that I was not recommending administrative action. I want you to understand that those are 2 separate statements. I understand, sir. Do you want to speak to the decision? She thought about how to answer this honestly without making it into something it wasn't. I'd make the same decision again, she said. In those conditions with that timeline, it was the right call. I acknowledge it was outside protocol. Cross held her gaze for a moment. Noted, he said. He moved on. Hooper. The gorge entrance. Your account. Hooper gave his account. It was thorough and accurate, and he didn't minimize anything, including the moment when he'd had to decide whether to engage a crew-served weapon with 3 rifles and had communicated his uncertainty up the chain before doing so. He was a good NCO. Mara respected that he reported the uncertainty rather than papering over it. When Hooper finished, Trent looked up from his notepad. The coordination between your element and Sergeant Voss's position at South Observation. How was that established? Radio, Hooper said. Direct frequency. She called the mark. She called the mark, Trent repeated. He looked at Mara. You coordinated a simultaneous shot across 2 positions, in a snowstorm, at night, with a combined engagement distance of approximately 230 meters from my position, she said, 40 meters from Hooper's. And the result was both primary targets were neutralized and the crew-served weapon was rendered inoperable before it became operational. Yes, sir. Trent looked at his notepad again. He wrote something. He had a way of writing that suggested the notes were not for his benefit. He was writing something for someone else who would read them later. Sergeant Voss, I'd like to understand your background a little better. Here it was. Sir, she said, your file shows exceptional performance ratings across 7 years of service. It shows a transfer from 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion approximately 14 months ago following an operational review. The details of that review are limited in what's available to me. I'm aware of that, sir. I'm not asking you to compromise anything that's legitimately classified. I'm asking you to help me understand what skills and experience you're drawing on, because what I'm seeing in this contact report is not standard infantry marksman capability. He paused. And I'd like to understand it properly before I write my assessment. She looked at the table for a moment. She looked at Cross, whose expression was carefully neutral. She looked at Ramsey, who was watching her with the particular stillness he used when he was making space for her to decide something without influencing the decision. 3rd Recon ran a program, she said. Small unit, 4 to 6 personnel. Extended reconnaissance and surveillance operations. High-value target environments. The program required specific skill integration, precision shooting, signals intelligence, environmental analysis. She paused. We operated in conditions where the difference between being seen and not being seen was usually something small: temperature differentials, sound discipline, track management in various terrain types. Another pause. Snow was one of the terrain types I worked most. How long were you in that program? 2 years? 4 months? And your marksmanship qualification? The long-range capability specifically? She thought about how to answer this. Not about what to conceal, but about how to explain something accurately that wasn't easily explained in terms of a standard military qualification structure. I qualified expert at standard distances, she said. Beyond that, there's no qualification that covers what I actually do. I worked with a program coach for the first year. After that, it was operational. Operational meaning you developed it on missions. Yes, sir. Trent wrote for a longer stretch than he had before. The tent was quiet except for the pen and the generator outside and someone moving past the tent wall in boots. The operational review, Trent said. He said it carefully. Not tentatively. Carefully. The way you approach a specific piece of terrain, you know, is sensitive. Without asking you to speak to classified specifics, is there anything about that review that bears on your current assignment, your capabilities, your judgment? The question was precise, and she respected it for being precise. It was asking, without asking directly, whether there was something wrong with her, whether the gap in her file was a gap because something had gone wrong with her rather than around her. She met his eyes. No, sir, she said. The review concerned actions taken by other personnel. I was a material witness. My role in the program was evaluated separately and rated satisfactory. She paused. The dissolution of the unit was unrelated to my performance. Understood. He made a final note and set down his pen. Thank you, Sergeant. Cross leaned forward slightly. The remaining items. Ramsey. The wire engagement. The debrief ran for another 90 minutes. By the time it concluded, the tent had the specific atmosphere of a space where a great deal of significant information had been exchanged, and everyone present was now privately reorganizing their understanding of events around the new shape of that information. Trent stayed after the others were dismissed. Mara was filing her copy of the contact documentation when she heard him speak to Cross in a low voice near the map table. She was close enough to hear, far enough that she could plausibly not have been listening. The unauthorized discharge, Trent said, the first night. Filed. No action recommended. I concur with that. A pause. The follow-on assessment she produced, the 3-element analysis. Accurate in every particular, as it turned out. Yes. Another pause. Longer. How long has she been here? 11 days? And she identified a multi-day reconnaissance operation, correctly assessed its structure and intent, predicted the timing and method of the main effort, and initiated a defensive response that disrupted all 3 elements. Trent was not making this a question. He was saying it in the way you say things you need to say aloud in order to establish that you understand them correctly. In 11 days, in a unit she'd never served with. That's accurate, Cross said. How'd she end up here? Cross was quiet for a moment. Transfer request from the reviewing authority. The notation said reassignment to forward element commensurate with skill set. He paused. I assumed it was a standard transfer. I'm revising that assumption. I'd revise it significantly, Trent said. Mara finished her filing and left the tent. The afternoon brought a specific kind of tired that was different from the exhausted but functional state she'd been managing since 0147. This was the tired that came after the body finally accepted that the emergency was over and began presenting its bill. The accumulated cost of 2 nights of partial sleep, sustained cold exposure, and the specific metabolic expense of operating at high alert for extended periods. Her legs felt weighted. Her eyes had the particular dryness of someone who had been staring at things in poor light for too long. She slept for 3 hours in the early afternoon, and when she woke, the camp had a different quality to it, quieter, more settled, the particular atmosphere of a forward base that had been tested and had held, and was now doing the slow work of absorbing that fact. She came outside to find Ramsey sitting on the supply crate she'd occupied that morning. He moved over without being asked. She sat beside him. The sky had cleared significantly. The storm had burned itself out sometime in the late morning, and what remained was a high, pale blue sky over the white peaks of the ridge, with a winter sun that gave light without warmth. Black Ridge Valley looked different in this light, less hostile, more simply remote, the mountains just mountains rather than something that was specifically trying to contain the camp. Battalion wants a full capability assessment, Ramsey said. He said it without preface, which was how he delivered information he wasn't sure how to frame. On the unit? On you. She looked at the ridge. When? Trent's requesting it through channels. Could be a week? Could be sooner. He paused. He flagged your file specifically, requested supplementary documentation. From 3rd Recon's records. That's my assumption. She was quiet for a moment. The familiar feeling of being looked at through glass, examined, assessed, categorized, settled over her. She knew this process. She'd been through versions of it before. The institutional machinery that processed people who didn't fit its standard categories was slow and not particularly comfortable, but it was thorough, and it generally arrived at an accurate conclusion if the input data was honest. The input data, in this case, was honest. Okay, she said. You're not worried about it? About being assessed? About what they'll find? She looked at him. There's nothing in the 3rd Recon record that damages me. I know what's there and what isn't. She paused. The review board cleared me. The rating was satisfactory. The circumstances that led to the dissolution were... She stopped. They were someone else's choices. Ramsey nodded. He'd heard this much before. The outline, not the detail. The team leader, he said. The one who couldn't find his weapon. His name was Kaysen, she said. Sergeant First Class David Kaysen. He'd been in that program for 3 years. He was... She thought about how to say what was true without it becoming more than she intended to give. He was the person who taught me most of what I know about working in cold terrain. He was good at his job, exceptionally good. What happened? On the operation. We were in an extraction phase. 3 days in, compromised position, moving at night through rough terrain. Kaysen and I were the rear element. We stopped at a cache point to reassemble the team, and in the process of moving from one covered position to another, he set his rifle down. She paused. 30 seconds. He set it down to help move an equipment case. And then 30 seconds later, contact. Ramsey was very still. He reached for it, and it wasn't there. Someone had moved the case. The rifle went with it, knocked over, slid 2 feet, disappeared in the dark. She looked at her hands. I fired because I had my rifle, because my rifle was where it always is. The contact broke off. But in the time it took Kaysen to find his weapon, she stopped. He was hit, Ramsey said quietly. He was hit. And the way he was hit at that angle, with his arm in that position, she let the sentence end without finishing it. The sun moved slightly behind the ridge edge, and the temperature dropped a perceptible degree. He doesn't blame you, Ramsey said. It wasn't a question. No, he wrote a statement for the review board. She almost said something else and didn't. But you carry it. I carry the 3 seconds, she said. The 3 seconds between when he reached and when I fired. If I'd been faster, you can't go faster than contact. I know. She said it flatly, not as acceptance, but as a fact she had rehearsed enough times that it had worn smooth and no longer cut her the way it used to. I know that, but I still carry those 3 seconds. And that's why the rifle stays where it stays. Ramsey didn't say anything for a long time. He looked at the ridge. He looked at his hands. He looked at the ridge again. Kaysen was at a desk position, he said finally. Regional support element. I served in adjacent unit a few years back. He said it without inflection, just placing a card on the table. She looked at him. You know him. I know of him. I never served with him directly. He paused. He has a reputation, the kind of reputation that means people who served with him remember it. She was quiet. The reputation, Ramsey said carefully, is not about the injury. He looked at her steadily. It's about what happened before the operation. The decisions leading to the compromised extraction. Decisions that had nothing to do with you. She absorbed this. She looked at the valley below the camp, where the supply route ran through the pass that had very nearly been closed permanently 8 hours ago. Why are you telling me? She said. Because you're carrying weight that isn't yours to carry. He said it simply, the way he said everything, without performance, without apology. And because you're going to be in a room with battalion personnel in the next week, and you're going to need to be clear about what belongs to you and what doesn't. She looked at him. You're not broken, Voss, he said. I want to be specific about that. She didn't know what to say to this, which was unusual. She generally had a response prepared for most things people might say to her. This one, she didn't. Okay, she said finally, which was not enough, but it was what she had. He nodded once and looked back at the ridge. Cross found her at the eastern observation post at 1600. He came alone, which was notable. Cross generally moved through the camp with purpose and with wherever his next task was as a destination. Coming to the observation post in the mid-afternoon with no apparent task attached was not his pattern. He stood beside her and looked at the gorge entrance. The crime scene tape, improvised, made from a length of orange surveyor's line that Torres had in her equipment kit, marked the outer edge of the area they'd been told not to disturb pending the formal investigation team that was coming with the battalion support convoy tomorrow. The gorge entrance itself was still shadowed, as it was every afternoon when the sun moved behind the western ridge. The pass, Cross said. Sir? The mines they found, IED configuration, anti-vehicle. He paused. 8-person convoy. 2 vehicle crew, 6 security. I know the math, sir. I want to make sure you know I know it. He said it quietly and without drama. The convoy would have driven into a prepared kill zone. She waited. Your assessment of the third element, he said. You raised it before I arrived at that conclusion, before Hooper. I had more context. I'd been thinking about the operation structure since the Gorge team set up the crew served. And the logic was, a support by fire position implies a supported element. Yes, sir. Which is doctrine, standard, he paused. But I'd been looking at the Gorge as the main effort, the wire as the diversion. I had it backwards. He said this with the particular precision of a man correcting himself on the record, to himself. You had it right, and I had it backwards, and I want to acknowledge that specifically. She looked at him. This was not what she had expected from this conversation. She'd expected a continuation of the debrief, maybe additional documentation questions. She had not expected this. Sir, she said carefully, you were working with the information available at that point. So were you. You made a different assessment. He paused. I need to understand why. Because if there's a gap in my tactical thinking, I'd rather know about it than not. She thought about how to explain this honestly. You were looking at the gorge because that's where the evidence was. The tracks, the antenna wire, the movement. Evidence at a location pulls your attention to that location as the primary threat. And you? I was looking at the gorge and asking who put that evidence there and why. She paused. When you find evidence of careful reconnaissance, people who spent 3 days building a targeting package, you expect them to use that work, to hit the thing they reconnoitered. The supply route was what they spent 3 days looking at. The gorge gave them a position to support that hit, so the gorge was the support element and the route was the target. Cross was quiet for a moment. That's a different frame. It's the frame I learned to use. What does the evidence say the enemy is trying to accomplish? Not where is the enemy? She paused. It's not always right. But tonight it was. Tonight it was. He looked at the gorge entrance. He had his hands clasped behind his back in the posture she'd come to recognize, and he was doing the thing he did where the visible part of him went still while the internal part worked through something. "The unauthorized discharge," he said. "First night." "Yes, sir." "It goes in the report as I filed it." "I understood that. What I didn't say in the report," he paused, "was that it was the right call. Because putting that in the report would have created a procedural problem for the documentation. But I'm telling you now, for the record between us." He looked at her. "It was the right call." She looked at him. She'd had people tell her she was right before, and it had meant different things in different circumstances. Sometimes it meant the person was relieved and was using the acknowledgement to manage their own discomfort. Sometimes it meant they genuinely understood what had happened and wanted to name it clearly. Cross was doing the second thing. She could tell. "Thank you, sir," she said. He nodded. He started to turn. "Sir," she said. He stopped. "The first day," she said. "The snow analysis. You said you didn't adjust mission parameters based on snow analysis." He looked at her with an expression that had something uncomfortable in it. Not guilt exactly, but the specific discomfort of a person reviewing a decision they'd made with the information they had and finding the decision defensible but not comfortable to look at directly. "I remember," he said. "I'm not raising it to create a problem," she said. "I'm raising it because it's the thing I need you to understand going forward. Not the shooting, not the tactical assessment, the snow." She paused. "The small things that don't come with obvious credentials. That's where the information usually lives." He was quiet. "I understand that it doesn't come through official channels," she said. "I understand it requires trusting a source you don't have a complete picture of. I understand that creates problems for documentation and for command decision-making." She held his gaze. "But it's what I have to offer, and if you can't use it, I'm significantly less useful to this unit than last night's contact report suggests." Cross looked at her for a long moment. "When you have something," he said slowly, "bring it to Ramsey first. Give him enough to build a picture I can work with." He paused. I don't pick up what you pick up. I'm built differently. I need the translation step." She nodded. "I can do that." "Then we're clear." "Yes, sir." He walked back toward the command tent. She watched him go. The straight back, the particular gait of a man who moved through spaces with the assumption that things would be in order when he arrived. He wasn't a bad officer. He was a different kind of thinker, which was not the same thing. And the difference had been costly in ways that had almost been catastrophic but hadn't been. And now they both knew something about each other that they hadn't known 11 days ago. The sun was low behind the western ridge. The valley was filling with the blue-gray shadow that preceded full dark in mountain terrain. The gorge entrance sat quiet behind its orange surveyor's line, giving nothing away. She looked at it for a while. Tavio Grant found her at the cook tent at 18:30, eating the first real meal she'd had since the eggs that morning. He sat across from her with his own plate and his bandaged arm, and the expression of a man who had slept in the afternoon and was feeling human again. "Hooper wants to talk to you," he said. "About what?" "Didn't say. He had the face, though." "What face?" "The face he gets when he's decided something." Grant moved food around his plate. "He had it before the gorge sweep this morning, before he asked you about 3rd Recon." She looked at her food. She thought about what Hooper knew and what he'd done with it. The shot he'd heard about from someone who served adjacent. The woman with a name he remembered. "When?" she said. "He said after chow." She ate her meal. She ate it completely, which was something she'd trained herself to do regardless of circumstances. Eat when food was available, because food was not always available. And when she was done, she brought her plate to the wash station and found Hooper outside the cook tent waiting. He was standing with his arms crossed, looking at nothing in particular, and when she came out, he turned and said, "Walk with me." They walked the perimeter. It was full dark now, the stars hard and close in the clear sky above the ridge. The watch was changed and the new guard positions were occupied, and the camp had settled into its nighttime rhythms with a quality that was different from the previous nights. Something slightly more settled about it, a solidity that hadn't been there before. "I'm putting in a recommendation," Hooper said. He said it without preamble, the way he said most things. "To Battalion, for a formal skill assessment and a special assignment review." She looked at him. "What you did last night," he said. "The coordination, the firing solution, the tactical call on the third element. That's not a standard infantry deployment skill set. You're wasted at a forward base in a surveillance role. I'm not wasted, she said. I'm functional. You know what I mean? She did know what he meant. She'd known it herself. In the quiet of post-operations, when the debrief was done and the paperwork was filed and the day became small and there was nothing left that required the specific things she was built for. She'd known it and chosen not to examine it closely because the examination led to a door she hadn't decided to open yet. The third recon dissolution, she said, doesn't have to define where you go from here. He said it firmly. I know people. I know the channels. If you're open to it, I'm thinking about it, she said. He accepted this. He didn't push. He was a man who delivered information and then gave people the space to do what they needed to do with it. They finished the perimeter walk in silence. When they got back to the point where their paths diverged, he stopped. For what it's worth, he said, the shot at the gorge entrance. I've been doing this for 14 years. I've worked with some capable people. He paused. That was the best piece of shooting I have ever personally witnessed. She looked at him. I'm just telling you what I saw, he said, and walked away. She stood at the junction of the path for a moment, in the dark and the cold, with the stars above the ridge very clear and the camp quiet around her and the gorge entrance invisible in the darkness to the east. She thought about Kaysen, about the 3 seconds, about the specific weight of something that happened 14 months ago in bad terrain in the dark, the way it had traveled with her to every assignment since, packed into the habit of a rifle kept close and a hand that never had to reach far. She thought about Hooper saying she was the best piece of shooting he'd witnessed. She thought about the way Grant had asked if she wanted eggs, and the way Ramsey had said she wasn't broken, and the way Cross had stood at the observation post and asked her to explain her thinking because he wanted to understand it. She thought about 11 days in a unit that hadn't known her, and everything that had been built in those 11 days, and the specific way trust worked in this environment. Not given, not assumed, but demonstrated, over and over, in the small moments that accumulated into something that held weight. She went back to her tent. She sat on her cot. She picked up her rifle. She field-stripped it in the dark. The bolt coming free, the barrel lifting clear, each component finding its place in the sequence she knew so completely that the darkness made no difference. She cleaned it. She reassembled it. She removed the magazine and set it in her boot. She lay down. The rifle rested against her chest. The sling crossed her forearm. The metal was cold and then gradually less cold as the sleeping bag trapped the heat between them. Somewhere outside, the generator ran its steady rhythm. Somewhere further, the ridge stood in the dark above the valley, keeping whatever it kept. Nobody in the tent laughed. Nobody said anything at all. She slept without dreaming. That was not always the case. There were nights, more of them in the 14 months since the extraction than before, when the dark behind her eyes wasn't empty but occupied, filled with the specific geography of bad terrain and the sound of contact and the 3 seconds that replayed themselves with the fidelity of something that had been recorded rather than remembered. Those nights she woke with her hand already on the rifle and her heart doing the specific thing it did when the body had been somewhere the mind didn't fully follow. This night was different. She woke at 05:30 to the generator and the distant sound of the cook tent starting its morning work. And for a moment she lay still and took inventory of where she was and what had happened and what day it was, the way she always did, the quiet internal accounting that preceded getting up. The rifle was where it always was. The tent was cold. Outside, the stars were probably still there above the ridge, doing what stars do. She felt rested. Not fully. She'd been running a sleep deficit since day 9 and 3 hours in the afternoon, and one night's uninterrupted sleep didn't eliminate that, but genuinely rested in a way that was distinct from the functional exhaustion she'd been managing. Something had loosened. Some internal clench that she'd been maintaining without quite realizing it had released during the night and left her lighter than she'd been in some time. She got up, she dressed, she took the rifle. The battalion support convoy arrived at 0840, which was 4 hours earlier than the original timeline, which meant someone in the logistics chain had decided the situation at Black Ridge Valley warranted expedited resupply. 3 vehicles, additional personnel, the investigation team Trent had mentioned, and, notably, a colonel named Ashford, who stepped out of the lead vehicle and looked at the camp with the contained, sweeping attention of someone taking a rapid inventory. Mara watched this from the eastern observation post. She'd been there since Yo 600, not because she was assigned there, but because the gorge entrance still needed watching, and she was the person who would notice if something changed about it. The surveyor's line was still in place. The gorge was still quiet. The evidence the investigation team would need was still where it had fallen. She heard the vehicles. She heard the camp responding to the arrival, voices, movement, the specific energy that a command-level visit injected into a forward base. She stayed at the post. Ramsey came to find her 20 minutes after the convoy arrived. "Ashford wants the unit assembled," he said. "Full personnel, 10 minutes. "Assembly point?" "South of the command tent." He paused. He read Trent's preliminary report on the drive up. She looked at him. "All of it?" Trent called it comprehensive. Ramsey's expression was not quite readable. "Which I think means yes." She slung her rifle and followed him back to the camp. The assembly was not a formal parade. This was a forward base in winter, and nobody expected squared-away dress uniforms and precise spacing. It was 16 people arranged in a rough semicircle in the snow, breath coming out in pale clouds, the morning sun just clearing the eastern ridge and laying long shadows across the white ground. Ashford was a compact man, mid-50s, with gray at his temples and the specific physical quality of someone who had spent enough time in field environments that his body had made permanent accommodations to them. He stood in front of the assembled unit with his hands clasped behind his back. The same posture Cross used, Mara noticed, which probably meant they'd been shaped by the same institutional pressures at some point, and he looked at each face in turn before he spoke. "I read Major Trent's preliminary after-action report," he said. No preamble. "I also read the contact documentation, the intelligence assessment, and the signals analysis your team produced over the past 72 hours. He paused. "This unit identified, assessed, and disrupted a coordinated three-element assault that was targeting this base and the primary supply route. The disruption was complete. The assault failed in all three elements. The supply convoy that would have driven into a prepared kill zone at the pass is currently en route, rerouted, and will arrive safely this afternoon." The camp was quiet. "That outcome was not inevitable," Ashford said. "It required specific decisions made under time pressure, with incomplete information, in conditions that made everything harder than it should have been." He looked at Cross. "Lieutenant Cross, your command made those decisions correctly." Cross straightened slightly. "Sir." Ashford looked at Ramsey. "Sergeant Ramsey." He looked at Hooper. "Sergeant Hooper." He looked at Grant. "Specialist Grant." He looked at each person he named with the same directness, giving each name its full weight. Then he looked at Mara. "Sergeant Voss," he said. "Sir." He held her gaze for a moment. "The preliminary report attributes the identification of the reconnaissance pattern, the assessment of the operational structure, the disruption of the primary contact, and the identification of the third element to your analysis and action." He paused. "Is that assessment accurate?" "It's a team outcome, sir. The contact was disrupted by multiple personnel acting on shared information. That's a diplomatic answer." "It's an accurate one, sir." Something moved briefly across Ashford's face. Not quite a smile, but the recognition of a specific quality he was apparently familiar with. "The formal commendations will go through proper channels," he said. He addressed the unit again. "What I can tell you here this morning is that the people on that supply convoy don't know what didn't happen to them. They'll drive through that pass this afternoon, and it will be a routine run, and they'll complain about the cold and argue about the radio station, and none of them will know that 8 hours ago there were mines in that road." He paused. "That's how it's supposed to work. The best outcomes are the ones nobody hears about." He unclenched his hands. "Dismissed, except Voss and Cross. Command tent." The command tent held 3 people, Ashford at the map table, Cross to his left, Mara across from them. Trent was present but positioned against the equipment rack in the way of a man whose role in this meeting was to have already done his job. Ashford looked at the map for a moment. Then he looked at Mara. "The third Recon dissolution," he said. "Sir, I have the complete record, not the version that's in your standard file, the complete record." He said it without emphasis, just establishing what he knew. "I want you to understand that before this conversation continues." She understood. The complete record meant the full operational review findings, the witness statements, the board assessment. It meant he knew about Kaysen and the extraction and the 3 seconds and what had happened before any of that. The decisions upstream that had put the team in a compromised position in the first place. Understood, sir, she said. The board found Sergeant First Class Kaysen responsible for the mission planning failures that led to the compromised extraction. That finding is in the record. He paused. Your conduct during the extraction was rated exceptional. That's also in the record. Cross was looking at the map. He'd heard this and was processing it with the particular stillness of a man absorbing information about someone he'd been forming an assessment of for 11 days and finding that assessment in need of significant revision. The dissolution of the unit, Ashford continued, was a resource and organizational decision following the operational review. It was not a judgment on the personnel. He paused. I want to be direct with you, Sergeant. The way that transfer was documented, the gap in your file, the minimal notation, that was not done in your interest. It was done because the full record was classified, and because the people handling the paperwork took the expedient path rather than the correct one. She held his gaze. I'm aware of that, sir. It created an impression that followed you to this assignment. Yes, sir. Lieutenant Cross will speak to that when he files his official after-action. Ashford looked at Cross briefly. Cross nodded once, without being asked, the gesture of a man who had already made this decision and was confirming it. Mara looked at Cross. He met her eyes directly. There was nothing complicated in it, just acknowledgement, clean and complete. The capability assessment Hooper requested, Ashford said. I'm approving it and expediting it. You'll go to the assessment center at the regional base within the next 10 days. He paused. I'll be frank with you. Based on what I've read and what I've heard this morning, I expect the assessment to support a special assignment recommendation. There's a unit being reconstituted, a successor to the 3rd Recon program, and they're building their personnel roster. Another pause. I'm not making a promise, but I'm telling you the landscape so you can make an informed decision about whether you want to pursue it. The tent was very quiet. She thought about the decision carefully. She thought about what it meant to go back, not to 3rd Recon itself, which was gone, but to the kind of work it represented. The extended operations, the isolation, the specific demands of working in environments where the margin for error was measured in seconds and meters. She thought about whether she wanted that again. She thought about Kaysen, about what Ramsey had said, that she was carrying weight that wasn't hers, about the fact that she had slept without dreaming last night for the first time in a long time. I want to pursue it, she said. Ashford nodded. Then we'll move forward. He stood. One more thing. He looked at her with the expression of a man delivering information he considered important enough to separate from the rest. Kaysen is at the regional support element. He's been told about this operation, about your role in it. He paused. He asked me to pass something along. She waited. He said, Ashford glanced at Trent, who produced a small folded paper and placed it on the table. He wrote it down, said he wanted to make sure the wording was right. She looked at the paper. She picked it up. She unfolded it. The handwriting was uneven in the way of a man writing with a hand that didn't fully cooperate. It said, You were always the best of us. Stop arguing with yourself about it. DC. She folded it again. She put it in her jacket pocket. She looked at the map on the table because that was the only neutral surface available, and she needed a moment to let the thing that had just happened in her chest settle before she looked at anyone. Thank you, sir, she said. Her voice was steady. Ashford picked up his cap. Dismissed, Sergeant. She came out of the command tent into the morning sun and stopped. Grant was 20 feet away, sitting on a crate with a coffee, watching her with the expression of a man who had decided to be casually present in a specific location for no particular reason. He lifted his mug slightly when she emerged. She walked over. He produced a second mug from beside the crate. He'd brought 2, which meant he'd planned this, and handed it to her. She sat beside him. They drank their coffee. Well, he said, assessment center, 10 days. For the new program? She looked at him. He raised his eyebrows. I listen, you know that. And she thought about being annoyed by how much he'd apparently absorbed through the camp's information channels, and found she wasn't actually annoyed. Possibly, she said. He nodded slowly. He looked at the ridge. You'd be good at it. I've been told. I'm saying it because it's true, not because someone told me to. He drank his coffee. I've worked with a lot of people. I know the difference between someone who can do hard things when they have to and someone who, he paused, searching for the right construction. Someone for whom hard things are just the normal setting. She didn't say anything. You're the second kind, he said, in case that wasn't clear. She looked at the gorge entrance. The investigation team was working there now. 2 people in cold weather gear, methodical, photographing, and measuring. The surveyor's line had been replaced with proper scene tape from their kit. What happens to you after this rotation? She said. Grant stretched his injured arm experimentally. Back to the main element, then probably wherever they need rifle teams. He paused. It's fine. I like rifle teams. Good at something more demanding. He looked at her sideways. Was that a compliment? It was an observation. From you, those are probably the same thing. He stood, picked up both mugs. I'll take it. He looked at her for a moment, the easy manner that covered the harder, more competent thing underneath. Don't disappear on us, Voss. When you get to wherever you're going. I'm not good at staying in touch, she said. Honestly, I know. Do it anyway. He walked back to the cook tent. Ramsay found her at 1100. She was at the eastern post again, a habit she'd apparently formed that the camp had stopped questioning. He came up beside her and looked at the gorge the way he always looked at things, as if whatever he found there would simply be dealt with. Ashford gave you the full picture, he said. Yes. The assessment. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Good, he said, just that. She looked at him. He was looking at the ridge. His jaw was set in the particular way it set when he had something more to say and was deciding whether to say it. Say it, she said. He looked at her. You're going to be fine, he said, at the assessment, at whatever comes after. You know that. I know it most days. Today? She thought about the folded paper in her jacket pocket, about the uneven handwriting, about the specific thing it had done to the weight she'd been carrying. Not eliminated it, but clarified it, the way light clarifies a room without changing the room's dimensions. Today I know it, she said. He nodded once. He looked at the gorge. Before you go, I want you to spend time with the unit. The whole unit. Not just Grant and Hooper. He paused. They need to learn what you know. Not just the shooting, the reading, the snow, the dogs, the radio patterns. He paused again. That knowledge doesn't belong to you alone. She thought about this. It was not something she'd considered. The transmission of what she knew, the deliberate teaching of things she'd built through years of experience in conditions most people in this unit hadn't worked in. She'd always treated her skills as a private capability, something she deployed but didn't explain. When? She said. Whenever you're ready. We have 10 days. She looked at the gorge. She thought about what she knew and how to put it into words that would be useful rather than just impressive. It was a different kind of problem than the tactical ones she was good at solving, and it required a different kind of thinking. Tomorrow, she said. Morning, start with the snow. Ramsay almost smiled. He didn't quite get there, but it was close. I'll tell Cross. He walked back to camp. Oh, the supply convoy arrived at 1420, rerouted through an alternate approach that added 40 minutes to the run, but bypassed the pass entirely pending the investigation team's clearance of the road. 4 vehicles, routine cargo, personnel rotating out. The drivers were exactly as Ashford had predicted, tired, cold, arguing about something she couldn't hear from where she was standing. They didn't know. She watched them unload and thought about this. The specific strangeness of it, that a thing could almost happen, could be planned and resourced and set in motion, and then stopped. And the people for whom it had almost happened could live their entire lives without ever understanding how close the edge had been. The convoy drivers would finish their run and eat their meal and sleep in a warm space somewhere, and the pass would just be a pass, the road just a road. That was correct. That was how it was supposed to work. She didn't need them to know. The next 9 days moved in a different rhythm than the 11 that had preceded them. The additional sensor package went in on day 2. Proper placement this time, covering the gorge entrance and the eastern approach in overlapping fields that left no gap of the kind that had existed before. The watch rotations were redesigned with input from Mara and then from the entire unit, each person contributing what they'd observed about the camp's vulnerabilities and the approaches they'd individually been responsible for. Cross ran these sessions without ego, which she respected, asking questions, incorporating answers, adjusting doctrine based on what the people who'd been in the field were telling him. She taught the snow on day one. She took the unit to the eastern approach at first light when the shadows were long and the surface variations were most visible, and she walked them through what she saw when she looked at a snowfield. Not the impressionistic sweep of someone checking a perimeter, but the specific technical analysis of surface texture, compression patterns, drift signatures, and the particular signatures that human and animal weight left in cold-packed snow versus fresh fall. Some of them got it quickly. Grant already had the instinct. He just needed the vocabulary. Delgado was methodical and applied the framework with the thoroughness he brought to everything. Leith, Corporal Becca Leith, who had pretended to be asleep the night of the rifle conversation and had said almost nothing to Mara directly in 11 days, stood in the snow and looked at what Mara was pointing at and said quietly, "I've been walking past this for 2 weeks and not seeing it." "You're seeing it now," Mara said. Leith looked at her. She had a direct quality when she chose to use it. "How long did it take you?" "To learn to read snow specifically? About 4 months. To trust what I was reading, longer." Leith absorbed this. She looked at the snow. She nodded once, the nod of someone filing something important. The dogs came on day 3. Dunn ran the session. Mara had asked him to because it was his domain and she was clear about not overreaching, but she contributed the framework around it. How to integrate dog behavior into a broader surveillance picture. How to distinguish between the different types of alert, what the silence meant versus the whimper versus the bark. Dunn was a good teacher. His easy manner made complex information accessible, and by the end of the session, the unit had a significantly more sophisticated understanding of how Axel and Bricks were communicating information that the sensors couldn't capture. The radio patterns she left to Torres, again asking rather than directing. Torres turned out to have a more sophisticated understanding of the clustering phenomenon than she'd initially indicated. She'd been hesitant to raise it because she hadn't been certain and hadn't wanted to be wrong in front of Cross. Mara recognized this hesitation from the inside. She'd felt it herself for most of her career. "If you're not certain and you don't say it," Mara told her, "and then it turns out you were right, the cost is paid by someone other than you." Torres looked at her equipment. "I know. So next time you're not certain." "I say it anyway." "And you say you're not certain. That's allowed. That's not weakness." Torres looked at her with the expression of someone being told something they'd known and forgotten and needed to hear again. "Okay," she said. Cross sat in on every session. He didn't direct them. He listened, asked precise questions when something was unclear, and took notes that she suspected would end up in a revised unit training framework after she left. On day 5, he showed her the revised version of his operational report, the after action that would go up the chain and become part of the permanent record. She read the section about her. He had corrected the record. Not just the account of the contact, though that was thorough and accurate, but the characterization of her initial concerns. He had documented her day 4 snow observation, her day 6 report on the dogs, her day 8 radio analysis. He had documented that these concerns had been raised through proper channels and had not received the response they warranted. He had not written it as an indictment of himself. He'd written it as an institutional observation, the kind of correction that makes future units better because someone was honest about what had worked and what hadn't. She handed it back to him. "This is accurate," she said. "That was the goal." He paused. "The section on the unauthorized discharge. I characterized it as a tactical decision made under time pressure with sound basis. I said the protocol violation was secondary to the outcome and that administrative action would be disproportionate. That's consistent with what you told me. I wanted you to see it in writing." He paused. "Because it goes on your record too, and I wanted it to say what it actually says rather than what people might assume it says." She looked at him. The man who had told her, 11 days ago, that he didn't adjust mission parameters based on snow analysis was standing in front of her, having spent 5 days carefully documenting everything she'd seen and said and done, and was making sure the documentation was honest. People could change. Not completely, not all at once, not without the push of events that forced them to look at themselves directly. But they could change. "Thank you, sir," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. in the way of a man who was uncomfortable with gratitude for things he considered basic professional conduct. Just when you're in whatever comes next, if you're ever in a position where someone brings you something that doesn't come through official channels. He paused. Listen first. Yes, sir, she said. On the 9th day, the assessment confirmation came through Torres's comms equipment, a formal notification that the evaluation would occur at 0800 on day 10 at the regional base, transportation arranged, duration approximately 6 hours. Mara read it. She passed it back to Torres. She went back to the eastern observation post and sat with it for a while. The gorge was quiet. It had been quiet for 9 days. The investigation team had cleared it on day 3, collected everything collectible, departed. The sensor package covered it now. The watch had it. There was a 2-man position at the entrance that rotated every 4 hours. Nothing had moved in that gorge since the 2 figures retreated into it at 0400 on the night of the contact. She didn't think nothing would move there forever. This was the kind of place that attracted this kind of attention, and the people who'd planned the operation against the camp hadn't abandoned their strategic objectives just because a single operation had failed. They'd revise. They'd adapt. They'd come back with different methods and different timing, and the camp would face something new that required the same fundamental discipline of paying attention to small things before they became large things. The camp knew how to do that now. Not perfectly. They'd never do it perfectly, and she'd never pretended that was the goal. The goal was to be less blind than you were before, to add the things you'd missed to the list of things you looked for, to build the habit of noticing incrementally, day by day, until the noticing became as natural as breathing. It wasn't a perfect system, it was a better one. She heard footsteps and turned. It was Leith, Corporal Becca Leith, who had been watching and listening and saying little for 9 days, who had stood in the snow and said, "I've been walking past this for 2 weeks and not seeing it." Leith sat down beside her. She had a rifle across her knees and she held it the way someone holds something they've stopped treating as equipment and started treating as a responsibility. "Tomorrow," Leith said. "Early transport." Leith nodded. She looked at the gorge. "Who covers the eastern post when you're gone?" "Same rotation as now. You're on it Thursday and Sunday." "I know." She paused. "I mean, who—" She stopped. She started again. "The way you cover it, what you're actually looking for." Mara looked at her. Leith was 26, capable, and had spent 11 days underestimating herself in the specific way of someone who'd been underestimated by others long enough to internalize it. "You do," Mara said. Leith looked at her. "I've been doing it for 9 days." "I know." "I don't know if I'm—" "You are," Mara said. Not to be kind. Because it was true. She'd watched Leith for 9 days, watched her apply the framework with increasing confidence and decreasing hesitation, watched her stop second-guessing what her eyes were telling her. You see it. You've been seeing it since day 2 of the snow session. You just haven't trusted it yet. Leith was quiet for a moment. How do you trust it? You use it, and you're right often enough that the track record starts to override the doubt. She paused. You're going to be wrong sometimes. That's part of it. You're wrong, you figure out why, you adjust. The trusting isn't about never being wrong. Leith looked at the gorge. She had the expression of someone accepting responsibility they'd been approaching for a while and were finally picking up. Okay, she said. She stood. Safe travel, Sergeant. She walked back to her post. The transport left at 0600. Mara was ready 15 minutes early, which was always how she handled departures. Not because she was anxious about missing them, but because the 15 minutes gave her time to do the last check without rushing, to make sure everything that needed doing was done. She checked her rifle. She checked her kit. She looked around the tent, her cot stripped, her corner of the space as she'd found it. Nothing left behind except the minor disturbance of someone having occupied it for 20 days. She carried her pack to the south gate where the vehicle was waiting. Ramsey was there. He was holding 2 coffees, which was apparently how the people at Black Ridge Valley marked significant moments, and she accepted the one he held out. The unit, she said, will be fine. He said it with the certainty of a man who had evaluated this carefully and arrived at a conclusion he was comfortable with. Leith's ready. Torres is ready. Hooper's going to watch the gorge like it personally offended him for the next month. She almost smiled. Cross-filed the report, he said. Trent confirmed it was received at battalion. It'll be at the assessment center before you arrive. Good. He looked at her. He had the expression of a man who had something to say and was deciding whether it was appropriate or necessary. He decided it was. I've been doing this for 16 years, he said. I've served with a lot of people. Some of them I remember because they were exceptional. He paused. You're one of those. She looked at him. The cold was doing what cold always did. Direct, indifferent, impersonal. The morning sky above the ridge was the pale, clear blue of a cold day that intended to stay cold. I'm not finished yet, she said. I know you're not. He said it like that was obvious. That's the point. The transport driver leaned out his window. 2 minutes, Sergeant. She finished her coffee. She set the mug on the ground. She looked at Ramsey one more time. Kaysen's letter, she said. Yeah. You knew he'd written it. Ramsey's expression didn't change, but something around his eyes did. The slight shift of a man who has been caught being more thoughtful than he usually allows to be visible. Ashford mentioned he wanted to pass something along, he said carefully. I may have encouraged that. She looked at him. You needed to hear it from him, Ramsey said simply. Not from me. From him. She picked up her pack. She walked to the transport. She stopped with her hand on the door and looked back. Not at the camp, not at Ramsey, but at the eastern observation post where Leith was standing with her rifle and her fresh competence and her 9 days of accumulated attention, watching the gorge entrance with the specific, focused patience of someone who had learned that the information was always there, in the small things, waiting for someone to stop walking past it. Then she got in the vehicle and closed the door. The transport moved south through Black Ridge Valley as the morning sun came over the eastern ridge and turned the snow gold for the brief time each day, when the light and the angle cooperated. The mountains were just mountains in this light. The pass, when they reached it, was a pass. The road clean. The evidence of what had almost happened there, removed except for the faint rectangular outline where the investigation team had dug up the mine placements and filled them back in. She looked at it as they drove through. She thought about the supply convoy drivers who'd come through yesterday and would come through again next week. She thought about Leith at the Eastern Post. She thought about Torres looking at the radio logs with the willingness to say, I'm not certain, rather than staying silent and paying the cost in someone else's currency. She thought about Cross filing an honest report about his own failures alongside his unit's success. She thought about a piece of paper in her jacket pocket with uneven handwriting that said, Stop arguing with yourself about it. She thought about the rifle on her lap, which was where it always was, which was where it always would be. Not because she was afraid, but because she had learned, at a cost she hadn't chosen, what the distance between a hand and a weapon could mean when the seconds stopped being abstract. The valley fell away behind the transport. The mountains rose on both sides and then gradually gave way to lower terrain. The road widened. The world opened. She rode without speaking and looked at the country going past and felt, for the first time in 14 months, something that was not quite peace. Peace was too simple a word for what someone like her arrived at, but something close to it, the sense of a weight accurately distributed, of things belonging where they were, of knowing that what came next would require everything she had, and that everything she had was enough. The rifle rested on her lap. The morning moved around her. She was ready. The person everyone overlooks is often the one carrying the knowledge no one thought to ask for. The habit that looks like fear is sometimes the thing that keeps everyone alive. Pay attention to the small things, the silence where there should be sound, the snow that lies too flat, the person in the corner of the room who hasn't said anything yet. They may be the only one in the building who already knows what's coming.